When a ruthless Silicon Valley CEO is ambushed in her own parking garage, she expects her security team to save her, not the invisible janitor who moves like death itself. But as Caleb Hart drops three armed kidnappers in seconds, then tries to disappear back into the shadows, Sloan Maddox realizes the man who's been mopping her floors is the most dangerous person in the building. And now she wants to know why a warrior is hiding behind a mop bucket. If you're ready for a story about hidden strength, impossible choices, and the family we build from broken pieces, stay with me until the end. And if you love this story, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The parking garage beneath Apex Technologies headquarters held the kind of silence that only existed in the dead hours between midnight and dawn. Concrete pillars stretched into shadow, and the hum of ventilation systems created a low, constant drone that most people stopped hearing after the first week of working there. For Caleb Hart, that hum had become white noise years ago, a backdrop to the rhythmic swish of his mop across polished floors, the quiet squeak of wheels on his cleaning cart, the measured breathing that kept him centered and calm. He was invisible here. That was the point. Caleb moved through the executive parking level with practiced efficiency, his movements economical and deliberate. At 38, he'd perfected the art of being overlooked, the slight hunch to his shoulders that made him seem smaller than his 6-foot frame, the downward tilt of his head that discouraged eye contact, the navy blue coveralls that marked him as maintenance, as background, as nothing worth noticing. His dark hair was trimmed short, functional rather than stylish, and the slight stubble on his jaw suggested a man too tired or too busy to care about appearances. But his hands told a different story. They were calloused and scarred, and they moved with the kind of controlled precision that came from years of training most people would never understand. When he gripped the mop handle, his fingers fell into position with automatic muscle memory, the same way they'd once held entirely different tools for entirely different purposes. The cart's wheels echoed softly as he made his way past the rows of luxury vehicles that filled the executive spaces. Mercedes, Tesla, Porsche, machines worth more than most people earned in years, sitting idle while their owners slept in homes equally expensive and equally empty. Caleb had stopped judging wealth a long time ago. These days he judged what people did with it, how they treated the people who had less, whether they saw past the uniform to recognize another human being. Most didn't. That suited him fine. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from Mrs. Chen, his neighbor who watched Mia while he worked nights. Everything good here. She went down at 8:30 after 2 stories and 3 glasses of water. That girl has a stalling routine that could make Navy SEALs jealous. Despite himself, Caleb smiled. Mia had inherited her mother's determination along with her dark curls and bright laugh. At 7 years old, she approached bedtime negotiations with the strategic focus of a military campaign. It was one of the 1,000 things that made his chest ache with love and loss in equal measure. He typed back, "She gets that from her mom. Thanks for staying late. I owe you. You owe me nothing. That little girl is a blessing. See you at 7. Caleb pocketed the phone and returned to his work. The executive level always took longer than the others, not because it was dirtier, but because perfection was expected here. Every surface had to gleam, every corner had to be spotless, every trace of human presence erased, so that when the sun rose and the executives returned, they could pretend they inhabited a world that maintained itself through magic, rather than the labor of people they'd never notice. He was finishing the area near the elevator banks when he heard it, the distinct click of expensive heels on concrete, sharp and quick. The sound came from the direction of the private entrance, the one reserved for the top tier of management. Caleb glanced at his watch, 12:47 a.m. Late, even for the workaholics who ran this place. He didn't look up. Looking up meant being seen, and being seen meant interaction, and interaction meant questions he had no interest in answering. Instead, he kept his head down and continued mopping, making himself part of the scenery, just another fixture in the landscape of late-night corporate emptiness. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied now by the soft rustle of fabric and the faint scent of expensive perfume cutting through the garage's oil and concrete smell. Caleb recognized the rhythm of those steps, quick, purposeful, slightly impatient. He'd heard them before, always moving fast, always with somewhere important to be. Sloan Maddox. Even without looking, he knew. The CEO of Apex Technologies walked like she owned the world, because in many ways, she did. Her company had revolutionized cybersecurity, made her a billionaire before 35, and turned her into the kind of woman whose face appeared on magazine covers with headlines like "The Iron Queen of Silicon Valley" and "How Sloan Maddox Built an Empire." Caleb had seen her exactly 3 times in the 18 months he'd worked here. Twice in passing, her attention focused on her phone while she strode through spaces he was cleaning, and once when she'd held a late-night meeting in the executive conference room while he emptied trash cans. She hadn't looked at him any of those times. He was wallpaper to her, background noise, part of the building's functional infrastructure. That was fine. Better than fine. The less attention he drew, the safer Mia stayed. The footsteps paused somewhere behind him. Caleb heard the electronic chirp of a car being unlocked, the soft beep of a security system disengaging. He kept mopping, his movement steady and unhurried, counting the seconds until the engine would start, and she'd drive away and he could finish his shift in peace. But the engine didn't start. Instead, he heard voices, low, male, urgent. Multiple voices where there should have been only one woman and her car. Every instinct that Caleb had spent 3 years trying to bury suddenly snapped to attention. His hands tightened on the mop handle. His breathing shifted, becoming deeper, more controlled. His peripheral vision expanded automatically, taking in the garage's layout with tactical precision he'd never quite managed to forget. Pillars offering cover at 12-foot intervals, emergency exits at the north and south ends, security cameras mounted in the corners but with blind spots near the structural supports. The voices grew sharper. A woman's protest cut off mid-word, the sound of something hitting the concrete, a briefcase maybe, or a phone. Caleb's body wanted to move. Years of training screamed at him to assess, to act, to neutralize the threat before it escalated. But his mind, the part he'd rebuilt after walking away from that life, held him frozen. This wasn't his fight. He had a daughter who needed him alive and whole, and far away from the kind of situations that ended with questions and investigations and people digging into backgrounds that couldn't withstand scrutiny. He should walk away, push his cart toward the service elevator, disappear into the building's interior, let corporate security handle whatever was happening in the executive parking area. That was the smart play. That was the play that kept Mia safe. A woman's voice rang out, sharp with fear and fury. "Take your hands off me!" Sloan Maddox sounded exactly like her reputation suggested, imperious even in crisis, used to having her commands obeyed. But beneath the authority, Caleb heard something else. Genuine terror, barely controlled. "Shut up and get in the van," a man's voice rough and impatient. "Do it quiet or we'll make this hurt." "You have no idea who you're dealing with," Sloan shot back. "My security? Your security ain't here, princess. It's just you and us. Now move." Caleb closed his eyes. Every fiber of his being knew what he should do. Nothing. He should let this play out. Let the systems in place handle it. Let someone else be the hero. He'd walked away from that role. He'd buried that part of himself because every time he'd put on the uniform, every time he'd gone into the field, he'd left Sarah alone. And eventually, she'd been alone when the cancer came, alone through too many treatments, alone in ways that still ripped him apart when he let himself think about it. He'd promised Mia, that he'd never be that person again, never risk leaving her the way he'd been forced to leave her mother. The sound of a struggle broke through his thoughts, bodies hitting metal. A muffled cry. Caleb's eyes opened. His hands released the mop handle. It clattered against the cart with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in his ears. And then he moved. Not like a janitor anymore, like what he'd been trained to be. Sloan Maddox had survived hostile boardrooms, attempted hostile takeovers, and more than one investor who thought her gender made her vulnerable. She'd built her company through sheer force of will and strategic brilliance that bordered on prescient. She'd faced down senators, negotiated with foreign governments, and once told a would-be sexual harasser exactly where he could shove his business proposal. But she'd never had a gun pressed against her spine. The cold metal bit through her silk blouse with shocking intimacy. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Sloan felt truly helpless. Her hands had been jerked behind her back so fast she'd dropped everything, Phone, briefcase, keys, and now strong fingers dug into her arms hard enough to leave bruises, while someone else bound her wrists with plastic zip ties that cut into her skin. 3 million, the man with the gun said. His breath was hot against her ear, reeking of cigarettes and something sour. Wired to an account we'll provide. You got 48 hours. You're insane, Sloane managed, hating how her voice shook. You'll never get away with... The gun jabbed harder, stealing her breath. We already got away with it. Van's 30 seconds away. By the time your people figure out you're gone, we'll have you somewhere your money can't find you. 3 of them, Sloane's mind cataloged with the same analytical precision she brought to quarterly reports. The one holding the gun, tall and rangy. The one binding her wrists, shorter but built like a boxer. And a third by the van with the side door already open, silhouetted against the garage's security lights. Professional, coordinated. They'd bypassed her security, knew her schedule, timed their approach for the exact moment when she was most vulnerable. Someone had planned this carefully, which meant someone close to her organization had betrayed her. The realization sent ice through her veins. She could handle external threats. Those were just business. But betrayal from within meant she'd miscalculated, misread someone, failed to see the danger until it was too late. Move, the shorter man growled, shoving her toward the van. Her heels caught on the concrete and she stumbled, nearly falling. Only their grip on her arms kept her upright. Sloane's mind raced through options. She could scream, but at this hour, on this level, who would hear? She could fight, but with her hands bound and a gun at her back, that was suicide. She could try to talk her way out, appeal to their greed. Surely they wanted the money more than they wanted to hurt her. Wait, she said quickly. Whatever you're being paid, I'll double it, triple it. Just tell me who... Oh, save it. The man with the gun sounded bored. We got our orders. You got your price. Real simple. Orders. So they were hired contractors, not opportunists. That changed things, made them more dangerous because they had nothing to lose and everything to gain by following through. The van was 10 feet away. Then 5. Sloane had built her entire empire on the principle that there was always another play, always another angle, always a way to turn a losing position into a winning one. But as the van's interior yawned open before her, all shadows and restraints and the end of control, she realized that sometimes you just lost. Sometimes the world took everything and there was nothing you could do about it. The lights went out. Not gradually, all at once, as though someone had thrown a massive circuit breaker. The parking garage plunged into absolute darkness, the kind of black that disoriented and panicked. Sloane felt the hands on her arms tighten reflexively, heard the men cursing, felt the gun barrel press harder against her spine. "What the hell?" one of them started. A sound cut through the darkness, not loud, barely more than a whisper of displaced air, but it carried a quality that made Sloane's skin prickle with primal recognition. It was the sound of something dangerous moving fast. The man holding her left arm simply disappeared. One second his fingers were digging into her bicep, the next she was spinning free, off balance in the darkness. She heard a muffled impact, flesh on flesh, and then a body hitting the ground with a heavy, final sound. "Contact left!" the man with the gun shouted, his professionalism cracking into panic. "Marco, get the..." Another sound, another body falling. Sloane's heart hammered against her ribs. She couldn't see anything, couldn't orient herself in the absolute blackness. The zip ties still bound her wrists behind her back, but no one was holding her anymore. She took a stumbling step backward, then another, trying to get distance from whatever was happening in the darkness. The third man, the one by the van, had a flashlight. The beam cut through the black, sweeping wildly across the garage. In its jerky illumination, Sloane caught fragmentary images that her brain struggled to process. 2 bodies on the ground, not moving. The man with the gun spinning toward the light source, weapon raised. And someone else. A silhouette that moved with liquid precision, using the concrete pillars for cover, flowing from shadow to shadow with movements so economical they seemed almost casual. The man with the gun fired twice. The muzzle flash lit up the garage in strobing bursts, revealing his face twisted with fear, but the bullets hit nothing but concrete. The silhouette was already behind him. Sloane watched, trapped between terror and fascination, as a figure materialized from the darkness, like something conjured from nightmare. Taller than the gunman, moving with the kind of controlled violence that suggested extensive training. One hand clamped over the gunman's wrist, forcing the weapon up and away. The other delivered a strike to the side of the neck that was surgical in its precision. The gunman crumpled. 3 men down in less than 30 seconds. Maybe less than 20. The flashlight beam swung wildly as the third man by the van scrambled for his own weapon. But the silhouette was faster. The flashlight went out. Whether dropped or destroyed, Sloane couldn't tell. And in the renewed darkness, she heard a brief struggle, a choked-off cry, and then silence. Complete, absolute silence. Sloane stood frozen, her breath coming in short gasps, her bound hands numb behind her back. She couldn't see anything in the blackness, couldn't hear anything except her own thundering heartbeat. Whoever had just taken down 3 armed men was still out there in the dark with her. She wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at her to move, to get away, to put distance between herself and whatever terrifying force had just manifested in her parking garage. But her legs wouldn't cooperate, locked in place by adrenaline and shock and the absolute uncertainty of which direction safety even lay. Then she heard it. Breathing. Steady, controlled, close enough to make her flinch. Someone was standing right beside her. "Don't move." The voice was male, low, and calm, with the kind of steadiness that suggested the speaker's heart rate hadn't even elevated. "There might be others." Sloane's mouth went dry. "Who?" "Stay still." She felt more than saw him move away, heard his footsteps, deliberate now, no longer silent, as he crossed to where the emergency lighting controls were housed. Seconds later, the backup lights flickered on, bathing the garage in dim red emergency illumination. Sloane blinked against the sudden brightness, her eyes struggling to adjust. When they did, she found herself looking at her rescuer for the first time. He was nobody. That was her first visceral thought. The man standing 15 feet away, checking the pulses of the unconscious kidnappers with clinical efficiency, was absolutely nobody. Navy coveralls marked him as maintenance staff. His posture was careful, almost deferential. His face was the kind you'd forget 5 minutes after seeing it. Average features, dark hair, nothing distinctive. But his hands, those scarred, capable hands moved over the unconscious men with the practiced precision of someone who'd done this before, many times before. And his eyes. Even in the red emergency lighting, Sloane could see his eyes, dark and sharp and constantly scanning, processing the environment with an awareness that went far beyond normal. "You're..." Her voice came out scratchy, uncertain. "You're the janitor." He didn't look up from his work. "You should sit down. Shock can hit pretty hard once the adrenaline fades." "I'm not in shock." Sloane heard the snap in her own voice, the automatic defensiveness that had served her so well in boardrooms but sounded hollow in this moment. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. Your hands are trembling, you're breathing too fast, and you've got about 30 seconds before your knees give out." He moved to the third man, the one with the flashlight, and knelt to check his condition. "But if you want to collapse on concrete instead of sitting down like a reasonable person, that's your call." The sheer mundane practicality of his tone cut through Sloane's shock more effectively than any coddling would have. She glanced down at her hands, still zip-tied behind her back, and realized he was right. They were shaking badly. "I can't sit down," she said, trying to keep her voice level. "My hands are..." He was moving before she finished the sentence, crossing the distance between them with that same economical fluidity. Up close, she realized he was taller than she'd thought, broader through the shoulders despite the slight hunch he affected. And his face, which had seemed so forgettable from a distance, held details she'd missed. Small scars near his hairline, a nose that had been broken at least once, and those eyes that saw everything and revealed nothing. "I'm going to cut the ties," he said quietly. "Don't move." A utility knife appeared in his hand. She hadn't seen where he'd drawn it from. And then he was behind her, one hand steadying her arm while the other brought the blade to the plastic. His touch was impersonal, but surprisingly gentle, the kind of careful contact that spoke to someone accustomed to treating injuries, handling frightened people, working in high-stress situations. The zip ties parted with a soft snap. Blood rushed back into Sloane's hands with painful prickles, and she gasped despite herself. "Hurts," the janitor observed, already moving away. That's good. Means no permanent damage. Sloane rubbed her wrists, staring at the angry red marks the restraints had left. Her mind was trying to catch up with events, to process what had just happened, to find some framework that made sense of a janitor who moved like special forces and took down armed kidnappers with terrifying efficiency. "Who are you?" she demanded. He was already at his cleaning cart, reaching for his phone. "Nobody important. You should call your security team, and probably the police." "Nobody important doesn't fight like that." Sloane's voice gained strength as her shock receded, replaced by the fierce curiosity that had built her empire. "Nobody important doesn't drop 3 armed men in the dark like it's nothing." It wasn't nothing. He was dialing a number, his attention on the phone rather than her. They were sloppy and didn't expect resistance, amateurs pretending to be professionals. They had a gun. They had several guns, and zip ties and a van, and probably tranquilizers in that first guy's pocket if you check. He held the phone to his ear, waiting for someone to answer. But they didn't have training, just equipment. Makes them dangerous to civilians, less dangerous to... He trailed off, as though realizing he'd said too much. "Less dangerous to what?" Sloane pressed. "To people like you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he spoke into the phone. "This is Caleb Hart, maintenance staff. There's been an incident in the executive parking garage. Attempted kidnapping. 3 suspects unconscious. Ms. Maddox is safe. You need to send security and call the police." "Yes, I'll stay here." "No, I'm not injured. Just send people now." He ended the call and pocketed the phone, then finally looked at her directly. In the red emergency lighting, his face was all shadows and angles, and Sloane realized with the start that he was younger than she'd thought. Late 30s, maybe, though his eyes held the kind of weariness that came from experiences that aged you faster than years ever could. "They'll be here in a few minutes," he said. "You should probably check for injuries. They grabbed you pretty hard." Sloane shook her head slowly, not in negation, but in disbelief. "You're really going to pretend this is normal? That you're just, what, a janitor who happened to know how to take down armed kidnappers in the dark?" "I'm a janitor who did what anyone would do when someone was in trouble." His voice remained carefully neutral, but Sloane caught something underneath, a wariness, maybe, or a warning. That's all it was. Bullshit. The word came out sharper than she'd intended, fueled by adrenaline and fear, and the sudden, overwhelming need to understand what had just happened. "I've seen security footage. I've watched personal protection specialists work. What you just did wasn't instinct. It was training. Serious, high-level training." For a long moment, he just looked at her. Then, quietly, "What I am isn't your concern, Ms. Maddox. What I do is push a mop and empty trash cans. That's all you need to know." "But it's not all there is it?" Sloane found herself taking a step closer, drawn by the mystery despite her better judgment. "Who trained you? Where did you—" "Don't." The single word cut through her questions with unexpected force. His expression hadn't changed, but something in his posture shifted, not threatening exactly, but definitively closed off. "I helped you because it was the right thing to do. I don't want gratitude, I don't want recognition, and I especially don't want curiosity. I just want to finish my shift and go home to my daughter." Daughter. The word landed with unexpected weight, humanizing him in a way nothing else had. Sloane realized she was looking at someone who'd deliberately chosen invisibility, who'd built a life in the shadows for reasons that probably had nothing to do with lack of ambition and everything to do with protecting something precious. "I'm sorry," she heard herself say. "I didn't mean to—" Sirens cut through the garage, growing rapidly louder. Red and blue lights strobed through the entrance as multiple vehicles arrived simultaneously. Security, police, probably EMTs. Within seconds, the empty parking garage transformed into organized chaos. Officers swarming the unconscious kidnappers. EMTs checking Sloane for injuries despite her protests. Security personnel shouting questions and setting up a perimeter. In the confusion, Sloane lost track of the janitor. She was pulled aside by her head of security, who looked pale and terrified as he apologized and explained and swore that whoever had breached protocol would be fired immediately. Then came the police, wanting statements and details and her signature on a dozen forms. The EMTs insisted on checking her vitals, examining her wrists, asking about trauma and shock. It was nearly 3 a.m. before things finally calmed down enough for Sloane to break away from the crowd of officials and personnel. She looked around the garage, searching for the man who'd saved her, needing to thank him properly, to maybe convince him to let her do something for him in return. But he was gone. His cleaning cart sat abandoned near the elevator bank. The mop still leaned against it at a precise angle, and the bucket held water that hadn't yet grown cold. But the janitor himself, Caleb Hart, he'd said his name was, had disappeared as thoroughly as if he'd never existed. Sloane stood alone in the red emergency lighting, rubbing her aching wrists, and felt the world tilt slightly beneath her feet. She'd built her entire life on control, on understanding the systems around her, on knowing exactly who and what occupied her spaces. But tonight, she'd discovered that for 18 months, someone extraordinary had been working in her building, hiding in plain sight, invisible by choice rather than circumstance. And now that she'd seen him, really seen him, seen what he could do, she knew with absolute certainty that she couldn't let him disappear back into those shadows. Not until she understood why he'd buried himself there in the first place. Caleb made it exactly 7 blocks before he had to pull over. His hands were steady on the steering wheel. They always were. That was the training. But his chest felt tight and his breathing had gone shallow and sharp. He recognized the signs. Not panic exactly, but the delayed physiological response to high-stress engagement. The adrenaline spike during the incident had masked the body's natural alarm response. Now that he was safe and alone, everything was catching up. He sat in his 15-year-old Honda Civic, parked in a 24-hour grocery store lot, and forced himself through the breathing exercises that had been drilled into him years ago. 4 counts in, hold for 4, 6 counts out. Repeat until the sympathetic nervous system calmed, until his heart rate dropped back to baseline, until he could think clearly again. It took 10 minutes. When his hands finally stopped trembling, Caleb pulled out his phone and checked the time, 3:17 a.m. His shift didn't officially end until 6, but there was no way he was going back to that building tonight. The police would want to talk to him eventually. He'd given his name, after all, stupid mistake born of shock and instinct. But for now, he just needed to get home, to see Mia sleeping safe in her bed, to remind himself why he'd walked away from that life in the first place. He drove the rest of the way on autopilot, his mind replaying the garage incident in fragments, the way the kidnappers had moved, too coordinated to be random criminals, not coordinated enough to be professionals. Someone had hired them, given them basic parameters, probably promised them money they'd never have collected even if the job had succeeded. They'd been disposable assets, which meant whoever was really behind this was smart enough to keep their hands clean. And Sloane Maddox had recognized his training. Of course she had. The woman hadn't built a billion-dollar company by being oblivious. She'd seen the way he moved, heard the unconscious authority in his voice when giving instructions, probably already put together enough pieces to start asking dangerous questions. Caleb pulled into the parking space outside his apartment complex and killed the engine. The building was old, nothing special, but it was safe and clean and the neighbors looked out for each other. Mrs. Chen lived 1 floor up, Mr. Patel ran the corner store and always had popsicles for Mia, and the superintendent actually fixed things when they broke. It was a real community, the kind of place where people knew your name and asked about your day and meant it. It was everything Caleb had needed when he'd left his old life behind. He let himself into the apartment as quietly as possible. Mrs. Chen had a key, but she'd have gone home hours ago after he'd called to say he'd be late. The living room was dark, except for the nightlight shaped like a unicorn that Mia had insisted they needed. Caleb moved through the space automatically, checking the locks on the windows, verifying the security chain on the door, old habits that he couldn't quite break. Mia's bedroom door was slightly ajar, the way she liked it. Caleb eased it open and stood in the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. There she was, sprawled across her twin bed in her favorite unicorn pajamas, one arm wrapped around the stuffed bear that had been Sarah's as a child. Her dark curls spread across the pillow in tangled waves, and her face in sleep was peaceful and perfect, and so much like her mother's that Caleb felt his chest constrict. 7 years old. First grade. Already reading at a 3rd grade level, already asking questions about science and space, and why people sometimes hurt each other. She had Sarah's kindness and curiosity, Sarah's generous heart that saw the best in everyone. She also had Caleb's stubbornness and Sarah's determination, which meant bedtime had probably involved extensive negotiation and possibly a lengthy discussion about why breakfast couldn't include chocolate cake. Caleb allowed himself 30 seconds of just watching her sleep, absorbing the reality of her safety, her health, her existence, before he quietly pulled the door almost closed and headed to the kitchen. His phone buzzed as he was filling a glass with water. Unknown number. He stared at it for a moment, debating whether to answer, but some instinct made him pick up. Mr. Hart? Female voice, professional, crisp even at 3:30 in the morning. This is Patricia Reeves, head of human resources at Apex Technologies. I'm calling to inform you that you're on paid leave effective immediately, pending investigation into tonight's incident. Caleb's stomach dropped. Investigation? Standard protocol for any violent incident involving employees. The police have requested your full cooperation, and company policy requires we conduct our own review. You'll be contacted within 48 hours to schedule interviews with both our security team and legal department. I didn't do anything wrong. The words came out harder than he'd intended. I stopped a kidnapping. No one is suggesting otherwise, Mr. Hart. This is purely procedural. Patricia Reeves sounded like she'd had this conversation before, probably many times. In the meantime, please don't discuss the incident with other employees or on social media. Company counsel will be in touch shortly. She ended the call before he could respond. Caleb set the phone down carefully on the counter and closed his eyes. Of course. Of course they'd put him on leave. Of course there would be investigations and questions, and people digging into his background, pulling at threads that couldn't withstand close scrutiny. He'd known this would happen. The moment he'd stepped out of the shadows, the moment he'd chosen to act instead of hiding, he'd set this in motion. But Sloane Maddox had been in danger, and those men had been about to take her, and every piece of training he'd ever received had been screaming at him that he had the skills to help and therefore the obligation to try. So he'd tried. And now the consequences would come, the way consequences always did. Caleb finished his water and headed to his own bedroom. He'd sleep for a few hours. Not much. His body wouldn't allow more after the adrenaline. And then he'd figure out what to do next. Find another job, probably. Maybe move, if the situation got complicated. Pack up their life again, start over somewhere else, build another version of normal for Mia. It wouldn't be the first time. As he lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, Caleb wondered if Sloane Maddox was asleep yet. Probably not. She'd be running through everything that had happened, analyzing it with that sharp mind everyone said she possessed, already working on damage control and security improvements, and figuring out who'd betrayed her. He hoped she didn't try to find him. He hoped she'd take the easy answer, janitor with military background, right place at right time, and leave it at that. Because if she dug deeper, if she pushed past the careful walls he'd built between his past and present, she'd find things that were better left buried. Things that had killed better men than him. Things that could destroy the quiet life he'd built for Mia. But even as he thought it, Caleb suspected hope wouldn't be enough. Because in the red emergency lighting, in those few moments before chaos had descended, he'd seen something in Sloane Maddox's eyes that he recognized all too well. She'd seen a puzzle she didn't understand, and from everything he'd learned about her, Sloane Maddox never let puzzles stay unsolved. Sloane didn't sleep. She stood in her penthouse office overlooking the city, 62 floors above the streets, glass and steel and solitude, and watched dawn break over Silicon Valley while her mind ran through scenarios like code through a processor. Someone had tried to take her. Not kill her, which would have been almost cleaner, but take her. Extract ransom, probably ruin the merger deal she'd been negotiating for 6 months, maybe destroy Apex's stock price in the process. The kidnapping hadn't been about her personally, it had been about destabilizing everything she'd built, which meant someone close enough to know her schedule had betrayed her. Her phone buzzed for the 100th time since she'd gotten home. Marcus Chen, her head of security, with another update she didn't want to hear about how sorry he was, how this never should have happened, how he was implementing new protocols immediately. Sloane ignored it. She'd deal with Marcus later after she'd decided whether to fire him or just demote him to something humiliating. Right now, she had bigger concerns. She pulled up the personnel file on her laptop, the one her assistant had sent over at 4 a.m., without asking why Sloan suddenly needed detailed information on a night janitor. The file was disappointingly thin. Caleb Hart, hired 18 months ago through a third-party cleaning contractor. Basic background check had come back clean. No criminal record, no red flags, nothing remarkable except a home address in a modest neighborhood and an emergency contact listed as Helen Chen, neighbor. But the file also listed his previous employment, and that's where things got interesting. Before joining the cleaning company, there was a 2-year gap in his work history. Before that, 10 years marked only as military service, honorable discharge. Sloan pulled up a separate window and started searching. Military records were harder to access than corporate databases, but she had contacts who owed her favors, and people tended to cooperate when a billionaire expressed interest. Within an hour, she had enough pieces to sketch the outline of something that made her pulse quicken. Caleb Hart had been more than just military. The fragmentary record she could access suggested special operations, possibly Delta Force, though those files were sealed tighter than anything else. He'd done multiple tours overseas, received commendations she couldn't read the details of, and then suddenly separated from service 8 years ago, right around the time his wife had died. Sloan sat back in her chair processing. A special operations soldier loses his wife, leaves the military, disappears for 2 years, then resurfaces as a janitor working night shifts for barely above minimum wage. A man with his training could have done anything: private security, consulting, training roles that paid 6 figures minimum. Instead, he'd chosen invisibility. The question was why? Her office door opened without warning. Sloan looked up sharply, already knowing who would be bold enough to enter unannounced. Victoria Price, her COO, and the only person in the company who'd been with her from the beginning, crossed the office with a coffee cup in each hand and the expression of someone who'd already had a very long morning. "You look like hell," Victoria said bluntly, setting one cup on Sloan's desk. "When's the last time you slept? When's the last time you knocked?" "About 5 years ago, right before you told me that knocking was a waste of both our time." Victoria settled into the chair across from her, all sharp edges and sharper mind wrapped in designer businesswear. At 42, she'd been through 3 startup failures before Apex, and the experience showed in the calculating way she watched Sloan now. "The board is panicking. They want an emergency meeting to discuss security protocols and whether you need to step back from public appearances. Tell the board I'll step back when they pry this company from my cold, dead fingers." That's what I told them, but in slightly more diplomatic language. Victoria sipped her coffee, studying Sloan over the rim. "You want to tell me why you've been researching a janitor for the past 3 hours?" Of course Victoria knew. She always knew. It was what made her invaluable and occasionally infuriating. Sloan turned her laptop so Victoria could see the screen. "The man who saved me last night, Caleb Hart, former Special Operations, I think. Maybe Delta. His file has more gaps than information." Victoria's eyebrows rose as she scanned the sparse details. "And you're digging into him because men like that don't become janitors by accident." Sloan heard the edge in her own voice, the intensity that emerged when she'd found a problem worth solving. "He's hiding. Question is what he's hiding from." "Or who?" Victoria murmured. She set down her coffee and leaned forward. "Sloan, I understand you're curious. Hell, I'm curious. A janitor drops 3 armed kidnappers like he's swatting flies. That's worth investigating. But you need to be careful here." "Careful how?" "Careful about crossing lines." Victoria's tone gentled slightly. "If this man walked away from that life, he had reasons. Good ones, probably. And if you go digging into those reasons without permission, you're not being strategic. You're being invasive." Sloan felt herself bristle. "I'm trying to understand who's working in my building. That's not invasive, that's due diligence." "You're trying to understand who saved your life," Victoria corrected. "And there's a difference between gratitude and obsession. You're walking toward the latter." Before Sloan could respond, her phone rang. Not the cell, the office line, which only a handful of people had access to. She glanced at the caller ID and felt her jaw tighten. "I need to take this." Victoria nodded and stood, collecting both coffee cups. "Board meeting is at noon. Try to look less like you've been awake for 30 hours. Sloane waited until Victoria had closed the door before answering. Julian? Sloane. Julian Krell's voice came through smooth as expensive whiskey and just as poisonous. I heard about your excitement last night. How terrifying that must have been. Every word was calculated, delivered with the practiced sympathy of a man who'd built his career on appearing trustworthy while sabotaging competitors. Julian ran Krell Industries, Apex's primary rival in the cybersecurity market, and he'd been trying to acquire or destroy her company since the day she'd turned down his partnership offer. I'm fine, Sloane said flatly. Was there something you wanted? Just to express my concern, and to remind you that my offer still stands. The sympathy in his voice curdled into something sharper. Merge with Krell Industries. You get to stay on as a division head, maintain creative control, and most importantly, you get the security infrastructure of a larger organization. After last night, surely you can see the value in that. Sloane's hand tightened on the phone. Let me make something crystal clear, Julian. I'd burn Apex to the ground before I let you anywhere near it. And if I find out you had anything to do with last night, careful. His voice dropped the pretense of friendliness. Accusations like that require proof. And proof tends to disappear when you have the right resources. The line went dead. Sloane set the phone down slowly, her mind racing. Julian had called less than 12 hours after the kidnapping attempt, right when she'd be most vulnerable to pressure. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence, but Victoria was right. Accusations without proof were worse than useless. They showed your hand without landing the blow. She needed more information. She needed to understand who'd planned the attack and why. And she needed to understand why a man with Caleb Hart's skills was pushing a mop instead of running security operations. All roads led back to the janitor who'd saved her life. Sloane pulled out her personal cell and dialed Marcus Chen. He answered on the first ring. Ms. Maddox, I'm so... Save the apologies. I need you to do something for me, and I need it done quietly. She could almost hear Marcus straightening in his chair, eager to prove himself useful after last night's catastrophic security failure. Caleb Hart, the maintenance worker who intervened. I want to talk to him, find out where he is. He's on administrative leave pending investigation. Standard protocol for... I know the protocol. I wrote the protocol. Sloane stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city waking up below. Get me his home address. And Marcus? Do it personally. Don't delegate this. Understood. She ended the call and checked her watch. 7:43 a.m. Late enough that she wouldn't be waking anyone, early enough that she could catch someone before they disappeared into their day. Sloane Maddox hadn't built an empire by waiting for other people to provide answers. When she wanted to understand something, she went directly to the source. And right now, she wanted to understand Caleb Hart. Well, the knocking started at 8:15 a.m., sharp and persistent and entirely unwelcome. Caleb had managed maybe 3 hours of sleep, fractured by dreams of gunfire and darkness, and Mia calling for him from somewhere he couldn't reach. He'd finally given up around 7 and made breakfast, pancakes shaped like dinosaurs, because Mia had recently decided she wanted to be a paleontologist, while his daughter chattered about the book Mrs. Chen had read her, and whether velociraptors could really open doors like in the movies. Normal. Safe. His whole world contained in one small human with syrup on her chin and questions about everything. The knocking interrupted Mia mid-sentence about whether pterodactyls were technically dinosaurs. She looked up from her plate, curious rather than concerned, because in her experience the world was fundamentally safe, and knocking on doors meant friends or deliveries, or maybe Mr. Patel from the corner store with the cookies he sometimes brought. Caleb knew better. He stood slowly, every instinct going sharp and alert. Stay here, sweetheart. Finish your breakfast. But Dad, Mia. His tone was gentle but absolute. She heard it and subsided, returning to her pancakes with the wary expression she got when she sensed things weren't quite right. Caleb moved to the door, checked the peephole, and felt his stomach drop. Sloane Maddox stood in his hallway wearing casual clothes that probably cost more than his monthly rent. Designer jeans, a silk blouse, a leather jacket that looked effortlessly expensive. Her dark hair was pulled back, and without the power suits and boardroom armor, she looked younger than her 35 years. But her eyes held the same sharp intelligence he remembered from last night, and the way she stood, weight balanced, shoulders back, expression determined, told him she hadn't come here on a whim. She'd come here hunting answers. Caleb seriously considered not opening the door. He could pretend he wasn't home, wait her out, hope she'd give up and leave. But Mia was inside asking questions, and the walls of this apartment were thin, and most importantly, Sloan Maddox hadn't become a billionaire by accepting rejection easily. Better to deal with this now, on his terms, before she made it worse. He unlocked the door and opened it just wide enough to block the view inside. "Ms. Maddox, this is unexpected." "Mr. Hart." She didn't smile, didn't pretend this was a social call. "I'd like to talk to you." "I'm on administrative leave, pretty sure talking to you violates about 6 different HR policies." "I wrote the HR policies. Consider yourself granted an exception." She glanced past him, trying to see into the apartment. "May I come in?" "No." The word came out harder than he'd intended, protective instinct overriding politeness. "Whatever you need to say, you can say it here." For a moment, something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe, or offense at being refused. But then her expression shifted into something more calculating, and Caleb realized she was reassessing, adjusting her approach like she would in a negotiation. "Okay," she said quietly. "Here works. I came to thank you, properly. Last night was... I didn't handle it well. I should have said thank you before you left." "You were in shock. It's fine." "It's not fine." Her jaw tightened. "You saved my life. You put yourself at risk, considerable risk, and I didn't even get your name until I pulled your personnel file." Caleb felt ice slide down his spine. "You pulled my file." "Of course I did. Wouldn't you?" She held his gaze steadily. "A man with your training, working as a janitor, it raises questions. Questions that aren't your business. They became my business when you intervened last night." Sloan shifted her weight, and Caleb caught the slight wince that suggested her wrists still hurt from the zip ties. "Look, I'm not here to interrogate you. I'm here because I want to offer you a job." That threw him. "What?" "Head of personal security, full benefits, salary commensurate with your skills, which I'm guessing are considerable. You'd report directly to me, no bureaucracy, no red tape." She spoke quickly, like she'd rehearsed this pitch. "Based on what I saw last night, you're wasted pushing a mop. You should be—" "No." Caleb cut her off, absolute and final. "Thank you for the offer, but no." "You haven't even heard the details." "Don't need to. I'm not interested in security work. I'm not interested in any work that involves violence or risk or putting myself in situations where I might not come home." He could hear Mia humming inside, the sound of her fork scraping against her plate. "I have responsibilities that matter more than any salary you could offer." Sloane's eyes narrowed slightly. "Your daughter." Caleb went very still. "How do you know about—" "Your emergency contact is listed as your neighbor, but your personnel file mentions you're a single parent." Her expression softened fractionally. "I'm not trying to intrude. I'm trying to understand why someone with your capabilities would deliberately choose a job that wastes them." "Dad?" Mia's voice called from inside. "Can I have more juice?" "In a minute, honey," Caleb called back, never taking his eyes off Sloan, then lower. "My capabilities, as you call them, took me away from my family for years. They put me in situations that gave me nightmares and scars and skills I never wanted to use again. When my wife got sick, I was overseas. When she needed me most, I was doing classified work I couldn't talk about." His voice went rough despite his efforts to control it. "So forgive me if I don't see my training as an asset. I see it as a burden I carried until it cost me everything that mattered." Sloan was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its boardroom edge. "I'm sorry. About your wife." "Yeah, me too." Caleb started to close the door. "Thanks for coming by, and I'm glad you're okay. But I can't help you." "Wait." She put her hand on the door frame, not pushing but stopping him. "At least let me give you something for what you did. A bonus, compensation for—" "I don't want your money. Then what do you want?" The question came out frustrated, almost desperate. "There has to be something. Name it." Caleb looked at this woman, brilliant, driven, powerful enough to reshape industries, and saw someone who understood the world through transactions, through exchanges of value, through deals that balanced ledgers. She couldn't comprehend that some things didn't have prices, that some people had already paid enough. "I want you to leave me alone," he said quietly. "I want to finish my leave, go back to my quiet job, and raise my daughter without complications. That's all. That's everything." He closed the door before she could respond, locked it, and stood there listening to the sound of expensive heels retreating down the hallway. His heart was racing, his hands clenched into fists, and it took several deep breaths before he felt centered enough to return to Mia. She was still at the table, but her pancakes sat abandoned, and her dark eyes watched him with concern that was far too perceptive for 7 years old. "Was that lady from your work?" she asked. "Sort of." Caleb poured her more juice, grateful his hands were steady. "Nothing to worry about." "She seemed important." "She is, but not to us." He sat down across from Mia and tried to smile. "Now, tell me more about pterodactyls. Were they dinosaurs or not?" Mia launched back into her explanation, her worry forgotten in the excitement of sharing facts. But Caleb only half listened, his mind still on the woman who'd shown up at his door offering jobs and money and complications he couldn't afford. He'd told her to leave him alone. He'd been as clear as he could be. He just wasn't sure she'd listen. Sloane made it to her car before the anger hit. Not at Caleb Hart, though his rejection stung more than she wanted to admit, but at herself. She'd approached this wrong, used the wrong leverage, failed to read the situation accurately. She'd treated him like a corporate asset to be acquired rather than a person with his own motivations and boundaries. Victoria would have seen it immediately. Hell, Victoria had warned her this morning, and Sloane had ignored it because she'd been so focused on solving the puzzle that she'd forgotten puzzles were sometimes just people trying to live their lives. She sat in her Tesla, hands on the steering wheel, and forced herself to think strategically instead of emotionally. Caleb Hart didn't want money or prestige or opportunities. He wanted safety for his daughter. He wanted normalcy. He wanted to be left alone. Which meant her showing up at his apartment had been exactly the wrong move. Her phone rang. Marcus Chen again. "Tell me you have something useful," she said without preamble. "The kidnappers are talking, or one of them is guy named Brian Kozlov, small-time muscle for hire. Says they were contracted through an intermediary, never met the principal." Marcus sounded tired, probably hadn't slept either. "But he gave us the account number where they were supposed to receive payment. Our forensics team is tracing it now." "How long?" 24 to 48 hours, maybe less if we get lucky." Sloane ended the call and stared out at the modest apartment complex. Working-class neighborhood, kids playing in the courtyard, laundry hanging on balconies. The kind of place that felt like community rather than investment property. The kind of place where a man trying to rebuild his life might find safety in anonymity. She'd violated that anonymity. She'd brought her world crashing into his, and from the look in his eyes when he'd talked about his wife, his daughter, she'd reopened wounds that hadn't fully healed. Victoria was right. She was walking toward obsession, but obsession had built her company. Obsession had turned a college dropout with a revolutionary idea into a billionaire before 40. Obsession was her superpower and her curse, and she didn't know how to turn it off even when she should. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You should be more careful about digging into people's backgrounds. Sometimes you find things you weren't meant to see." Sloane stared at the message, ice crawling up her spine. The number was blocked. Untraceable. The timing was too perfect. Right after she'd pulled Caleb's file, right after she'd shown up at his apartment, someone was watching her. Someone knew she was investigating the kidnapping, and someone wanted her to stop. She forwarded the text to Marcus with instructions to trace it, though she knew he'd find nothing. Then she started her car and pulled out of the parking lot, checking her mirrors compulsively, seeing threats in every vehicle that stayed behind her too long. This was bigger than a simple kidnapping attempt. This was coordinated, sophisticated, and ongoing, which meant Sloane had a choice: back off like the threatening text suggested, or push harder and find out who was targeting her before they tried again. It wasn't really a choice at all. Sloane Maddox had never backed down in her life. She wasn't starting now. But as she drove back toward her office, she couldn't stop thinking about Caleb Hart's face when he talked about his daughter, about choosing safety over capability, about wanting nothing more than to be left alone. She'd respected his wishes today. She'd leave him out of this. Because if she was going to hunt down whoever had tried to take her, she'd do it without dragging an innocent man and his 7-year-old daughter into the crossfire. That was the least she could do after he'd saved her life. 3 days passed in careful normalcy. Caleb took Mia to school, picked her up in the afternoon, helped with homework about the solar system, and practiced spelling words about animals. They went to the park, where Mia made friends with another girl who also wanted to be a paleontologist, and they could spend an hour discussing the relative merits of different dinosaur species. They had dinner with Mrs. Chen, who made dumplings and told stories about growing up in Taiwan, while Mia listened with rapt attention. Normal, safe, uncomplicated. But Caleb couldn't shake the feeling of waiting for the other shoe to drop. Apex's HR department had called twice to schedule interviews about the parking garage incident. The police had called 3 times, wanting detailed statements and follow-up questions. Caleb had cooperated with both, keeping his answers factual and minimal, offering no information beyond what was directly asked. And Sloan Maddox hadn't contacted him again. That should have been a relief. Instead, it made him uneasy in ways he couldn't quite articulate. She'd shown up with an offer, he'd refused, she'd left. Simple. Clean. Exactly what he'd wanted. So why did he keep checking the news for stories about Apex Technologies? Why did he find himself scanning articles about cybersecurity acquisitions and corporate espionage, looking for signs that something else had happened? He told himself it was just residual hypervigilance, the way his training kicked in whenever he sensed incomplete situations or unresolved threats. He'd intervened in the kidnapping, but whoever had planned it was still out there. That loose end bothered him the same way unsecured perimeters and unswept rooms used to bother him. It had nothing to do with Sloan Maddox specifically, nothing to do with the way she'd looked standing in his doorway, powerful and vulnerable at the same time, nothing to do with the sharp intelligence in her eyes, or the quiet desperation underneath when she'd asked what he wanted. He was lying to himself. He knew it. On the 4th day, Mrs. Chen knocked on his door around noon while Mia was at school. She had her serious face on, the one that meant she was about to say something he wouldn't like. "There's been a man," she said without preamble. "Watching the building. Different car each day, but same man. He took photos of the entrance this morning." Every protective instinct Caleb possessed went on high alert. What did he look like? Tall, white, maybe 40, wearing a suit, very professional. I wouldn't have noticed except Mr. Patel mentioned seeing someone taking pictures yesterday, too. Caleb's mind was already moving through scenarios, calculating threats and responses. Professional surveillance on his home meant someone had connected him to the parking garage incident and wanted to know more. Could be reporters, though they usually worked in packs. Could be corporate investigators from Apex doing background checks, though they'd be more discreet. Could be something worse. "Did you see which way he went?" Mrs. Chen shook her head. "He drove away when I started looking at him. But Caleb..." She put her hand on his arm, concern creasing her face. "Should I be worried? Should I be worried for Mia?" No. The answer came automatically, firmly, because Mrs. Chen needed reassurance and Mia needed stability. But internally, Caleb was already running through contingencies. Just keep doing what you're doing, watching out, staying aware, and call me immediately if you see him again. After Mrs. Chen left, Caleb spent 20 minutes checking every window in his apartment, verifying sight lines and access points, looking for signs of electronic surveillance. He found nothing, but that didn't mean nothing was there. His phone rang. Unknown number again. He let it go to voicemail, then listened to the message with his jaw clenched tight. "Mr. Hart, this is Detective Sarah Morrison with the SJPD. We need you to come in for a follow-up interview regarding the incident at Apex Technologies. Please call me back at your earliest convenience to schedule a time." The detective's voice was professional, neutral, revealing nothing. But the timing made Caleb's instincts scream. Surveillance on his building, now police requesting another interview. Either it was coincidence, which he didn't believe in, or someone was applying pressure, looking for leverage, trying to figure out who he really was. He needed information. He needed to know what was happening beyond the walls of his careful, quiet life. Which meant he needed to do the one thing he'd sworn he wouldn't, reach back out to his old world. Caleb pulled out his phone and scrolled through contacts until he found a number he hadn't called in 3 years. Thomas Briggs, Former team leader, current private security consultant, one of the few people from his previous life who understood why he'd walked away. The phone rang 4 times before a familiar gravel voice answered. "Well, hell, didn't expect to hear from you." "Tom." Caleb felt tension he didn't know he'd been carrying ease slightly at the sound of his old friend's voice. "I need a favor." "That's what people say before they ask me to do something illegal." "Just information. You still have contacts at JSOC? Intelligence community?" Tom was quiet for a moment. "You in trouble, Caleb?" "Maybe. I don't know yet. That's why I'm calling." "Tell me what happened." Caleb gave him the abbreviated version. The parking garage, the intervention, Sloan Maddox showing up at his apartment, now surveillance and police follow-ups. He kept it factual, emotionless, the way he'd been trained to deliver after-action reports. When he finished, Tom let out a low whistle. "You really know how to pick them." "Sloan Maddox is major league, brother. The kind of person who attracts major league problems." "I didn't pick her. I just happened to be there." "Yeah, but you didn't just happen to drop 3 armed kidnappers like you were still running ops. You revealed yourself." Tom's voice turned serious. "People are going to want to know who you are, what you can do, whether you're an asset or a threat. That's why you're being watched. That's why the cops want another interview. They're building a profile." "So what do I do?" "You want my honest advice? Pack up, move somewhere else, start over. This particular fire, you don't want to be near it." "I have a daughter in school, friends, stability, a life. I can't just run every time things get complicated." "Then you need to control the narrative before someone else does it for you." Tom paused, then added quietly, "And Caleb? Be careful. If Maddox has enemies sophisticated enough to attempt a coordinated kidnapping, they're not going to stop just because attempt 1 failed. If they think you're protecting her, if they think you're involved, I'm not involved. I made that clear. Doesn't matter what you made clear. Matters what they perceive. And right now, you're the guy who took down their operation. That makes you a problem they might want to solve." After Tom hung up, Caleb sat in his empty apartment and faced the truth he'd been avoiding. By saving Sloan Maddox, he'd made himself visible. And visibility, in his experience, led to danger following you home. He thought about Mia, about her dinosaur obsession and her bright laugh, and the way she trusted the world to be fundamentally safe. He'd built that safety for her, constructed it carefully from normalcy and routine, and staying far away from the kind of people who solved problems with violence. But now those people might be looking at him, might be wondering if he was a threat, might be calculating whether a janitor with dangerous skills needed to be neutralized. Caleb picked up his phone and pulled up Sloan Maddox's contact information, not from his personal phone, but from the company directory he still had access to during his administrative leave. He stared at the number for a long time before finally typing a text. "We need to talk, not about jobs, about who tried to take you and whether they're still a threat, because if they are, I need to know, for my daughter's safety." He hit send before he could second-guess himself. The response came back in less than a minute. "I'm listening, where, and when." Caleb closed his eyes and felt the last walls of his carefully constructed sanctuary beginning to crack. He'd wanted to be left alone. He'd wanted peace and normalcy and distance from his old life. But sometimes he was learning the only way to protect the peace was to step back into the war. Just this once, just long enough to make sure Mia stayed safe. Then he'd walk away again. He'd rebuild the walls. He'd return to being invisible. He had to believe that was still possible, because the alternative, that he'd been pulled back in permanently, that his past had finally caught up with his present, was too terrifying to contemplate. They met in a place neither of them controlled. A coffee shop in Palo Alto, mid-afternoon on a Thursday, crowded enough to provide cover but public enough to feel safe. Caleb arrived 20 minutes early out of habit, scanned exits and sightlines, chose a corner table with his back to the wall and clear views of both entrances. He ordered black coffee he didn't drink and waited with the patience that came from years of surveillance operations where movement meant compromise. Sloan walked in exactly on time, because of course she did. She'd traded the casual clothes from his apartment for professional armor, tailored pants, a fitted blazer, heels that added 3 inches, and made her stride even more commanding. But her face looked tired, drawn in ways makeup couldn't quite hide. And when her eyes found him across the crowded shop, He saw wariness there that matched his own. She ordered something complicated with extra shots and too many modifiers, then crossed to his table and sat without asking permission. For a moment they just looked at each other, two people who'd been thrown together by violence and were now trying to figure out whether they were allies or simply strangers connected by circumstance. "You said we needed to talk," Sloane began, wrapping her hands around her cup like she needed the warmth. "I'm listening." Caleb leaned forward slightly, keeping his voice low enough that surrounding conversations would mask it. "Someone's watching my apartment, professional surveillance, different vehicles, taking photos. My neighbor noticed, which means they're either sloppy or they don't care about being seen." Something flickered across Sloane's face, concern, maybe guilt. "I didn't send anyone to watch you." "I know, but someone connected me to that parking garage and now they're trying to figure out who I am and whether I'm a threat." He held her gaze steadily, which means whoever planned your kidnapping is still active, still gathering intelligence, still looking for angles, and that makes my daughter vulnerable. "I'm sorry." The words came out quiet but sincere. "I never meant to drag you into this." "You didn't drag me anywhere. I made a choice." Caleb's jaw tightened. "But now I need to know what I'm dealing with. Who wants you badly enough to attempt a coordinated kidnapping? Who has the resources to hire professionals and the motivation to keep pushing after the first attempt failed?" Sloane was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd been carrying this alone for too long. "His name is Julian Krell. He runs Krell Industries, my biggest competitor in the cybersecurity market. We've been at war for years, corporate espionage, patent disputes, stealing each other's clients. But it's always been business, never personal, never violent. Until now." "Until now," she agreed. 3 weeks ago, I finalized a merger with a European defense contractor. It would have made Apex the dominant player in military-grade cybersecurity, worth billions and effectively shutting Krell out of that market permanently. The deal was supposed to close next month. Caleb processed this, his tactical mind already seeing the shape of it. The kidnapping was meant to derail the merger. Extract ransom, create chaos, maybe make you look unstable or vulnerable. That's what I thought initially, but then I got this. She pulled out her phone and showed him a text message. The number was blocked, but the content was clear. "You should be more careful about digging into people's backgrounds. Sometimes you find things you weren't meant to see." "When did you receive this?" 4 days ago, right after I pulled your personnel file and came to your apartment." Sloane's expression hardened. "Someone's monitoring my communications, my computer activity, possibly my physical movements. They knew exactly when I started investigating you." Caleb felt ice slide down his spine. This was worse than he'd thought. Not just a failed kidnapping, but ongoing surveillance, active threats, enemies with deep access to Sloane's personal and professional life. "Have you told anyone? Police? FBI?" "My head of security knows about the text. The police are investigating the kidnapping, but they're moving slowly, following procedure. They don't see the bigger picture because I haven't given it to them." She met his eyes. "Because if I'm right about Julian, if he's really escalated from corporate warfare to actual violence, then I need proof before I make accusations. Otherwise, I'm just the paranoid CEO who can't handle competition." "You're not paranoid. You're being hunted." Caleb kept his voice level despite the anger building in his chest. "And whoever's doing it has resources, access, and motivation to keep pushing until they get what they want." That text wasn't just a warning, it was a power play. They wanted you to know they're watching, wanted you scared and uncertain. "I'm not scared." Sloane's chin came up, defiant. "I'm angry. Someone violated my company, tried to kidnap me, and now they're threatening the people who helped me. That's not fear-inducing, that's declaration of war." Despite everything, Caleb felt a flicker of reluctant admiration. Most people would have hired bodyguards, retreated behind lawyers and security teams, let professionals handle the threat. But Sloane Maddox had built her empire by confronting problems directly, and even with her life in danger, she wasn't backing down. It was going to get her killed. "You can't fight this alone," he said bluntly. "You're brilliant in boardrooms, but this isn't business anymore. This is operational planning by people who know how to stay invisible and strike when you're vulnerable. You need professionals." "I tried hiring a professional. He turned me down." The corner of her mouth quirked in something that wasn't quite a smile. Said he just wanted to push a mop and raise his daughter in peace. That's still true, but peace doesn't exist if there's a threat circling both of us. Caleb leaned back, forcing himself to think strategically instead of emotionally. Here's what we know. Julian Krell wants to stop your merger. He hired people to kidnap you. That attempt failed. Now he's applying pressure through surveillance and intimidation. The kidnappers are in custody, but they were contracted through intermediaries, so there's no direct connection back to him. My forensics team is tracing the payment accounts, Sloan added. But those trails take time to follow, and Julian has the resources to bury evidence through shell companies and offshore accounts. So we need leverage, something that forces him to back off because continuing becomes more costly than retreating. Caleb's mind was already working through scenarios, falling back into patterns of strategic thinking he'd thought he'd left behind. What does Krell care about most? What would hurt him if it was exposed? Sloan considered this, her sharp mind visibly processing options. His reputation. Krell Industries trades on trustworthiness. They handle security for governments, Fortune 500 companies, critical infrastructure. If it came out that he was connected to kidnapping, corporate espionage, violent intimidation, his entire business would collapse. Clients would flee, contracts would be canceled, his stock price would crater. Then that's the pressure point. We find proof of his involvement, and we threaten to expose it unless he leaves you alone. Finding proof requires getting close to him, getting access to his communications, his financial records, his network. Sloan shook her head slowly. I've tried legal channels, discovery in our patent lawsuits, regulatory investigations, but he's too careful. Everything's compartmentalized, delegated to cutouts, impossible to trace back to him personally. Legal channels aren't the only channels. Caleb heard his own words and felt something twist in his chest. This was the edge of a cliff, the moment before commitment, the last chance to turn back. But Mia's face floated through his mind, her bright smile, her innocent trust that her father would keep her safe. And beneath that, Sarah's voice, rough with illness, but still strong with conviction. Take care of our girl. That's all that matters. Just take care of her. He'd failed Sarah by being absent when she needed him most. He wouldn't fail Mia by ignoring a threat until it was too late. Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting? Sloane's voice was careful, neutral, but her eyes had gone sharp with something that looked like hope. I'm suggesting that sometimes the only way to stop a threat is to understand it from the inside. Where does Krell live? Who does he trust? What patterns does he follow? Caleb pulled out his phone and opened a notes app. Tell me everything you know about him. Personal life, habits, security arrangements, social circles, everything. For the next 40 minutes, Sloan talked and Caleb listened, building a mental profile of Julian Krell, the way he used to build profiles of hostile targets. Divorced twice, no children, lived in a fortress-like estate in Atherton with private security and surveillance that rivaled government installations. He worked obsessively, rarely socialized, maintained a tight circle of advisors who'd been with him for decades. His company was his identity, his creation, his legacy, which made it both his greatest strength and his most vulnerable point. He's hosting a charity gala next week, Sloan said, scrolling through her phone. Annual fundraiser for tech education, invitation only, extremely exclusive. Every major player in Silicon Valley will be there, including me. It's expected. Showing up is part of the ecosystem. Will his inner circle be there? The people who'd know about his off-books operations? Some of them. His COO, Daniel Voss, never leaves his side. His head of security, Marcus Raines, will be running the event, and his personal attorney, Elena Vasquez, usually attends these things because they're networking opportunities. Sloan looked up from her phone. But even if we're both at the gala, we can't just walk up and demand answers. Krell's too smart for that. We don't need to confront him. We need to listen. Caleb's mind was already working through approach vectors, thinking about security gaps and human vulnerabilities. Rich people at charity events drink, they gossip, they talk more freely than they should. If Krell's people are there, they might slip. Say something revealing, make a connection we can follow. You're talking about going undercover at a charity gala. Sloane's expression shifted into something that looked almost like excitement. Pretending to be someone you're not. getting close to his people, gathering intelligence. It's a terrible plan with about a dozen ways to go wrong, but it's better than waiting for them to come at you again. Caleb met her eyes. I can get you information, but you need to understand something. This is a one-time thing. I help you neutralize this threat. Make sure Krell backs off, then I'm done. I go back to my life, you go back to yours, and we pretend this never happened. Understood. Sloane's voice was steady, professional, the billionaire CEO negotiating terms. What do you need from me? Access to everything you have on Krell. Surveillance photos, financial records, organizational charts, litigation documents, anything that helps me understand how he operates. And I need you to get me into that gala. That's easy enough. I can bring a guest. No. Caleb shook his head firmly. You show up with a janitor as your date. That draws attention we can't afford. I need to be invisible, just another face in the crowd. Can you get me in as staff, catering, security, anything where I can move through the event without being noticed? Sloane thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. The catering company Krell uses is the same one we use for Apex events. I know the owner. We've done business together for years. I can make it happen. Then do it. And Sloane? He waited until she looked at him directly. Once I'm inside, you stay away from me. No acknowledgement, no interaction, nothing that suggests we're working together. If this goes bad, if we're caught, I need you to have plausible deniability. I'm not going to hang you out to dry if things go wrong. Yes, you are, because I've got a 7-year-old daughter who needs at least one parent, and you've got a company with thousands of employees depending on you. We both have responsibilities that matter more than protecting each other. His voice gentled slightly. This is the deal, Sloane. I help you, but on my terms. And my terms include keeping you as far from direct risk as possible. Something complicated crossed her face. Frustration, maybe, or respect, or some mixture of emotions she couldn't quite name. But finally she nodded. Okay, your terms. They spent another 20 minutes working through logistics and contingencies before Sloane's phone buzzed with a call she had to take. She stood, gathering her things, but paused before leaving. Caleb? Her voice was different now, not the CEO, just a person who'd been scared and was trying to be brave. Thank you for helping me, for not just walking away. I'm helping my daughter, he corrected gently, making sure she stays safe. You're just part of that equation. Sloane nodded, but something in her eyes suggested she didn't quite believe him. I'll send you the information tonight, and I'll arrange the catering position. The gala is Friday at 7. After she left, Caleb sat alone with his cold coffee and the weight of choices he couldn't take back. He'd just agreed to conduct an unauthorized intelligence operation against a billionaire who'd already demonstrated willingness to use violence. He'd committed to infiltrating a private event, gathering evidence that might not even exist, all while staying invisible to security professionals who were paid to spot exactly the kind of thing he was planning. It was reckless and dangerous and probably illegal. It was also necessary because the alternative was waiting for Julian Krell to strike again, and next time Caleb might not be there to stop it. Next time Mia might be home alone with Mrs. Chen when men with guns came looking for leverage. He pulled out his phone and texted Tom Briggs. I need tactical gear. Basic kit, nothing fancy. Can you source it without questions? The response came back quickly. I can. But, Caleb, once you cross this line, there's no uncrossing it. You sure about this? Caleb stared at the message for a long time before responding. No, but I'm doing it anyway. The next 4 days passed in careful preparation. Sloane sent encrypted files containing everything Apex had on Julian Krell. Surveillance footage from legal depositions, financial analysis from their litigation, organizational charts showing his company's structure, even personal details like his favorite restaurants and gym schedule. Caleb absorbed it all, building a mental map of his target the way he used to before missions. Tom arrived on Tuesday with a duffel bag containing items Caleb had requested, a high-quality audio recording device that looked like a pen, a microcamera that could be clipped to clothing, encrypted communication equipment, and a tactical knife that was small enough to conceal but effective enough to matter if things went completely wrong. They didn't talk about why Caleb needed these things, but Tom's expression said everything his words didn't. "You've got my number," Tom said as he was leaving. "Anything goes sideways, you call me. I can be there in 30 minutes with people who know how to extract assets from hostile environments. It's a charity gala, not a combat zone. Brother, anywhere you're conducting unsanctioned intelligence operations is a combat zone. Don't forget that." Tom gripped his shoulder hard. "And don't forget you've got a little girl who needs you alive." After Tom left, Caleb spent hours practicing with the equipment until operating it was automatic, muscle memory rather than conscious thought. The recording pen had to be positioned just right to capture clear audio. The camera needed steady hands and good timing. The communication gear had to be concealed perfectly because any bulge or wire would draw attention from security professionals who knew what to look for. He also spent time with Mia, more than usual, soaking in her presence like he could store up her laughter and questions against whatever was coming. They went to the Natural History Museum and looked at dinosaur skeletons. They made cookies shaped like fossils. They read stories about brave paleontologists discovering new species. And when Mia asked if paleontologists ever got scared, Caleb told her the truth. "Everyone gets scared sometimes, sweetheart. Brave doesn't mean not being afraid. Brave means being afraid and doing the right thing anyway. Are you scared sometimes, Dad?" "Yeah," he admitted, pulling her close. "Sometimes I am." "What are you scared of?" "Losing you," he thought. "Failing to keep you safe. Becoming the kind of person I swore I'd never be again." "I'm scared of spiders," he said instead, making her giggle. "Those 8 legs are just excessive." Thursday afternoon, Sloan called from a blocked number. "You're confirmed. The catering company thinks you're a server they're hiring for the event. You'll report to the service entrance at 5:30 for orientation and uniform assignment. Your name for the evening is David Martinez. I created a full background including references and employment history in case anyone checks." "Good." Caleb made notes on a pad, his handwriting careful and precise. "What about Krell's inner circle? Who should I focus on?" "Daniel Voss, his COO, drinks too much at these events. Gets chatty after his 3rd scotch. Elena Vasquez, the attorney, is more careful, but she's ambitious. She likes showing off her access to power, might drop information to impress people. Marcus Raines, head of security, won't say anything useful, but watch him. His patterns tell you where the security gaps are." "And Krell himself?" "Untouchable. He'll make an appearance, give a speech, but he doesn't mingle. Stays surrounded by his people, never alone, never vulnerable." Sloan paused. "Caleb, if this doesn't work, if you can't find anything, then we try something else, but one step at a time." He softened his voice slightly. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine. Focused." "That's not what I asked." Silence stretched between them, heavy with things neither of them quite knew how to say. Finally, Sloan spoke quietly. "I keep thinking about what you said. About your wife. About being away when she needed you. I've spent my whole life building something that matters more than relationships, more than personal connections. And now I'm realizing that when someone tries to destroy you, the thing you built can't save you. Only people can." "Sloan, I'm not asking for anything," she cut him off quickly. "I'm just saying thank you for being the person who showed up when it mattered." Before Caleb could respond, she'd ended the call. He sat in his quiet apartment, phone in hand, and tried to push away the uncomfortable realization that he was starting to care about Sloan Maddox as more than just a problem to solve. She was brilliant and damaged and determined in ways that reminded him of himself. Someone who'd built walls to survive and was now discovering that walls kept out danger, but also kept out connection. It didn't matter. Couldn't matter. He'd help her neutralize the threat, then they'd go back to their separate worlds. That was the deal. He had to keep telling himself that because the alternative, that maybe Mia deserved to see her father connected to the world instead of hiding from it, that maybe he deserved something more than just survival, was too complicated to face right now. Friday arrived with California sunshine and a knot of tension in Caleb's gut that he recognized from pre-mission briefings. He dropped Mia at school with extra hugs and promises to be home for Saturday morning pancakes. He called Mrs. Chen and confirmed she'd do pick up and stay overnight, casual and normal. Like this was just another work evening instead of something that could go catastrophically wrong. Then he drove to the address Sloane had provided, a mansion in Atherton that sprawled across 3 acres behind gates and walls and security cameras. The service entrance was exactly where she'd said it would be, and when he gave the name David Martinez, the harried catering manager barely looked at him before handing over a uniform and pointing toward the changing area. "You're on champagne service," she said, already moving to deal with another crisis. That means circulating through the ballroom with trays, keeping glasses full, being invisible. You get a 30-minute break at 8, bathroom breaks as needed, and if any guest tries to engage you in conversation beyond drink orders, you smile politely and extract yourself. Got it? Got it. The uniform fit perfectly. Black pants, white shirt, black vest, all designed to make servers blend into the background. Caleb checked his appearance in a mirror and saw exactly what he wanted to see. Nobody important, just another face hired to make the evening run smoothly. The recording pen went in his vest pocket, positioned so the microphone would capture conversations nearby. The micro camera clipped inside his collar, angled to record whatever he faced directly. The communication gear stayed in a small bag he'd leave in the staff area, too risky to wear, but available if he needed extraction. At 6:30, the servers were gathered for a final briefing. The catering manager went through protocols and expectations while Caleb studied the venue's layout. Grand ballroom with multiple exits, service corridors connecting to the kitchen, exterior doors for loading and emergencies. Security was visible but not oppressive. Private guards stationed at entry points, cameras covering major spaces, enough presence to deter problems but not enough to make guests uncomfortable. Julian Krell had designed this to feel exclusive and safe. Caleb intended to use that confidence against him. The guests began arriving at 7, and suddenly the mansion transformed into controlled chaos. Servers circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres, musicians played elegant jazz, and people in clothes worth more than cars talked and laughed and performed the elaborate social rituals of Silicon Valley's elite. Caleb moved through it all with a tray of champagne glasses, his posture slightly hunched, his expression pleasantly neutral, his awareness sharp and constantly scanning. He logged faces, matched them to the organizational chart Sloane had provided, tracked movement patterns and conversation clusters. Within 30 minutes, he'd identified Daniel Voss holding court near the bar, Elena Vasquez working the room with calculated charm, and Marcus Rain speaking quietly into a radio while his eyes never stopped moving. And there, making an entrance that suggested choreographed timing, was Julian Krell himself. He was shorter than Caleb expected, maybe 5'8", but he carried himself with the self-assurance of someone who'd built an empire and knew his own worth. His suit was impeccable, his silver hair styled perfectly, and his smile was practiced and cold. He greeted guests with handshakes and brief conversations, always moving, never staying in one place long enough for anyone to demand too much of his time. Caleb watched him and understood immediately why Sloane considered him dangerous. This wasn't a man who lost control or acted impulsively. This was a strategist who calculated angles and executed plans with precision. If he'd ordered the kidnapping, he'd done it knowing the risks and accepting them as worthwhile, which meant stopping him would require more than just evidence. It would require making him believe that continuing was more dangerous than retreating. Caleb drifted closer to Daniel Voss, offering champagne to guests nearby while his recording pen captured the COO's conversation. Voss was already on his second drink, his face flushed and his voice carrying farther than it should. "Julian's been stressed lately," Voss was saying to someone who looked like a venture capitalist. "The Apex situation has him working 18-hour days, but he's handling it." "I heard there was some drama with Maddox," the VC replied. "Something about a security incident?" "Nothing that changes the fundamentals. She's vulnerable right now, making mistakes, losing focus." Voss grinned. 6 months from now, Krell Industries will be the only name that matters in military cybersecurity. Caleb's hand tightened on his tray. Not direct evidence, but confirmation that Krell's inner circle knew about Sloane's troubles and expected them to benefit. He moved away, continuing to circulate, letting the recording run while he tracked other conversations. Elena Vasquez was harder to approach. She stood in a group that included Sloane, and getting close meant risking recognition. But luck intervened when Vasquez broke away to take a phone call, moving toward a quieter corner near the terrace doors. Caleb drifted close under the pretense of clearing empty glasses from a nearby table. "No, the situation is contained." Vasquez was saying into her phone, her voice low but intense. The contractors were disposable. The accounts are buried under enough layers that tracing them is pointless. As far as law enforcement is concerned, it was a random targeting that went wrong. She listened to whoever was on the other end, then laughed softly. Julian's not worried. He's playing a longer game. Everything that's happened so far is just opening moves. Caleb felt his blood run cold. This wasn't speculation or gossip. This was direct knowledge of the kidnapping plot, confirmed by Krell's own attorney. The recording pen was capturing every word, but he needed more. He needed something that couldn't be explained away as coincidence or misunderstanding. He was considering how to get closer when someone gripped his arm hard enough to hurt. "You're new." Marcus Raines, head of security, stared at him with eyes that missed nothing. "I don't recognize you from previous events." Caleb kept his expression neutral, slightly confused, the way a server caught off guard might look. "David Martinez, the agency sent me over this morning. First time working this venue. Show me your ID." This was the moment. The test. Caleb pulled out the fake identification Sloan had arranged, watched Raines examine it with professional thoroughness. The ID would hold up to casual inspection, but if Raines ran it through databases or called to verify, the whole operation would collapse. "You have an unusual posture for a server," Raines observed, handing back the ID. "Former military?" "Marines. 4 years? Nothing special?" Caleb delivered the cover story with easy confidence. "Got out, needed work, catering pays better than most service industry jobs." Raines studied him for another long moment, then nodded slowly. "Stay visible. Don't linger too long in any one area. And if any guests make you uncomfortable, find me or another security officer immediately." "Yes, sir." As Raines walked away, Caleb released a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. That had been too close. He needed to finish gathering evidence and get out before someone looked closer, asked harder questions, figured out that David Martinez was a construct designed to hide someone else entirely. He was heading back toward the ballroom when he saw something that made every instinct scream warning. 2 men in suits, not dressed like guests, not dressed like security, something in between, were standing near the service entrance talking quietly. One of them held a phone showing what looked like a surveillance photo. And when he glanced up, his gaze swept across the room with the kind of systematic scan that spoke to training Caleb recognized. These weren't Krell's people. They were hunting someone. The question was who? Caleb turned away smoothly, using other servers as cover while he watched from his peripheral vision. One of the men said something into a radio. The other nodded and started moving through the crowd, his attention focused and intent. They were searching for someone specific, and given the timing, given everything that had happened over the past week, Caleb had a sinking certainty about who their target might be. He pulled out his phone. Servers were allowed to check for emergency messages during the event, and sent a text to the encrypted number Sloan had provided. Security issue. 2 unidentified men, professional grade, searching the venue. Possible threat. Where are you? The response came back within seconds. East Terrace. Alone. Caleb's heart kicked into overdrive. Sloan was isolated, outside, exactly where someone planning an extraction would want their target. And 2 trained professionals were inside the venue searching, which meant there might be more outside waiting. This wasn't intelligence gathering anymore. This was an active threat. He had maybe seconds to decide. Stay invisible and let Sloan handle her own security, or blow his cover and intervene before something catastrophic happened. It wasn't really a choice at all. Caleb set down his tray, stripped off his vest so he looked less like staff, and started moving toward the East Terrace with the kind of purposeful speed that drew no attention but covered ground fast. As he walked, he ran through options and scenarios, calculating threats and responses, feeling his training snap into place like armor he'd never quite taken off. He'd walked away from this life. He'd promised himself, promised Sarah, promised Mia that he was done being the person who ran toward danger instead of away from it. But Sloan Maddox was alone on a terrace, and men with training were hunting her, and somewhere underneath all his carefully constructed walls, Caleb was still the person who couldn't let innocent people get hurt when he had the skills to stop it. Even if it cost him everything. Even if it meant he could never go back to being invisible again. He pushed through the terrace doors and stepped into the night, his eyes adjusting quickly to the darkness, his body already moving into combat stance. And he hoped, desperately, futilely, that he wasn't too late. The terrace was empty. Caleb's eyes swept the space in microseconds, cataloging details his training had taught him never to miss. Elegant stone balustrade overlooking manicured gardens, ambient lighting designed more for atmosphere than security, 3 separate staircases leading down to the grounds, shadows everywhere that could hide threats or provide cover. But no Sloan. His pulse hammered against his ribs as he moved forward, staying close to the wall, using the architectural features for concealment while his gaze tracked every movement in the darkness below. The garden stretched out like a maze of hedges and fountains, beautiful and treacherous, dozens of places where someone could be taken or hidden. Then he heard it. Low voices from the north staircase, urgent and strained. 1 female, 2 male. His body moved before his mind finished processing, flowing down the steps with predatory silence, every sense locked onto the sound. He found them near a fountain 30 yards from the house. Sloan stood with her back to the water, her face pale but defiant in the scattered moonlight. 2 men flanked her, the same ones from inside Caleb recognized instantly, and they held themselves with the careful tension of professionals trying not to escalate a situation they still believed they controlled. "Ms. Maddox, we're here to escort you to safety," the taller one was saying, his tone reasonable but his posture aggressive. "There's been a credible threat against your life. We need to move you to a secure location now." "I didn't request security." Sloane's voice was steady, but Caleb heard the fear underneath. "And I don't know you, so unless you can show me credentials from my actual security team, I'm not going anywhere." "Ma'am, we don't have time for this. The threat is imminent." The shorter man moved closer, reaching for her arm. "Please don't make this difficult." That's when Caleb stepped out of the shadows. She said no. His voice cut through the night, low and absolutely certain. "So I suggest you back away and explain exactly who you work for and what you're really doing here." All 3 of them spun toward him. The 2 men's hands went automatically to concealed weapons, confirming they were armed, confirming this wasn't legitimate security, while Sloane's eyes widened with recognition and something that looked like relief. "Sir, this doesn't concern you," the tall one said, his hand still hovering near his jacket. "This is a private security matter. Private security doesn't corner someone in gardens and pressure them to leave against their will. That's called kidnapping." Caleb moved forward slowly, positioning himself between Sloane and the men, his body language calm but his stance ready for violence. "So let's try this again. Who sent you?" The shorter man's expression hardened. "Last chance. Walk away now or we'll assume you're part of the threat we're neutralizing." "You really want to do this here? 20 yards from a party full of witnesses, security cameras covering half the grounds, professional security inside who'll respond to any disturbance." Caleb kept his voice conversational, almost friendly, the way he used to negotiate with hostage takers. "Smart play is to leave now. Report back to whoever hired you that the situation was too exposed. Bad play is to escalate and end up in police custody, explaining why you were threatening a prominent CEO at a charity event." The 2 men exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Then the tall one's hand moved toward his weapon with deadly intent. Caleb was faster. He closed the distance in 2 steps, his hand clamping around the tall man's wrist before the gun cleared its holster. A sharp twist, a strike to the elbow joint, and the weapon clattered to the stone pathway. The man tried to counter with his free hand, but Caleb had already shifted position, using the man's own momentum to send him stumbling backward into the fountain with a heavy splash. The shorter man was drawing his own weapon when Sloane moved. She grabbed a decorative stone from the garden border and threw it with surprising accuracy, hitting him in the shoulder hard enough to ruin his aim. The gun went off, a sharp crack that would definitely be heard inside, but the bullet went wild into the hedges. Caleb was on him before he could fire again. A knee to the solar plexus doubled him over. Then Caleb stripped the weapon away and delivered a controlled strike to the side of the neck that sent him crumpling to the ground, conscious but unable to coordinate his movements. The tall man was climbing out of the fountain, water streaming from his suit, his face twisted with rage and reaching for something in his jacket, a backup weapon or maybe a radio. Caleb raised the confiscated gun, not pointing it directly but making the threat clear. "Don't." Single word, absolute authority. "Your partner's down, you're outmatched, and that gunshot means security is coming. You've got maybe 30 seconds to disappear before this turns into something you can't walk away from." For a long moment, the tall man just stared at him, calculating odds and outcomes. Then he hauled his partner to his feet, half carrying him as they stumbled toward a gap in the hedge that clearly represented a planned escape route. "This isn't over," the tall one called back. "She can't hide forever." Then they were gone, swallowed by darkness and distance. Caleb immediately moved to Sloane, scanning her for injuries even as his ears tracked sounds from the house. Shouting now, footsteps, Marcus Rain's voice barking orders. They had maybe 2 minutes before security swarmed the gardens. "Are you hurt?" He gripped her shoulders, forcing her to focus on him. "Sloane, are you hurt?" "No, I'm fine." But her hands were shaking and her breath came too fast. "They came out of nowhere, said there was a threat, tried to get me to leave with them. If you hadn't, we don't have time. Listen to me carefully." Caleb pulled out the recording pen and pressed it into her hand. "This has audio of Krell's people confirming their involvement in your kidnapping. The camera in my collar has footage from tonight. Take these, get them to someone you trust, someone who can verify the evidence and use it as leverage." "What about you?" "I was never here. David Martinez, the server, will disappear into the confusion, just another staff member who panicked when gunfire started. But you need to get back inside now. Let security find you. Play the victim who was attacked again." He was already moving, putting distance between them. "And Sloane? Whatever happens next, whatever pressure Krell applies, you have ammunition now. Use it." "Wait!" She reached for him, but he was already backing away. "Caleb, I can't just—" "Yes, you can. You're Sloane Maddox. You built an empire from nothing. You can handle one corporate predator with ego problems." He managed something that might have been a smile. "Go. Before they find us together, and this gets complicated." Security burst onto the terrace above, flashlights sweeping the grounds. Caleb melted into the shadows near the hedge line, moving with the practiced silence of someone who'd spent years disappearing when needed. He heard Marcus Rains calling for Sloane, heard her response, shaken but strong. And then he was through the hedge, across a service path, over a low wall into the neighboring property. By the time police sirens wailed in the distance, Caleb was 3 blocks away, walking calmly toward where he'd parked his car, his server clothes already stripped off and hidden in a bag. Just another person out for an evening stroll, nothing remarkable, nobody worth noticing. His phone buzzed. Tom Briggs. "You good?" Tom asked without preamble. "Yeah." Extraction went smooth, no casualties. Caleb climbed into his car and pulled away from the curb, keeping his speed exactly at the limit. "But we've got a bigger problem. Krell sent a team to grab Sloane during the event. They were professionals, well informed about her location. This is escalating fast." "You get what you needed?" Audio confirmation from his attorney. Should be enough for leverage, if not prosecution. Caleb merged onto the highway, his hands steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through his system. "I'm out now. Clean break. She's got the evidence. She can handle it from here." Tom was quiet for a moment. "You sound like you're trying to convince yourself." "I'm stating facts. My involvement is over. I did what I needed to do to neutralize the threat to my daughter. That's it." "Brother, you just conducted an armed intervention at a billionaire's charity gala. You extracted assets under hostile surveillance, engaged enemy combatants, and provided intelligence to a civilian. That's not neutralizing a threat. That's running an operation." Tom's voice gentled. "You can't put this particular genie back in the bottle." Caleb didn't answer because Tom was right. He'd crossed lines tonight that couldn't be uncrossed, revealed himself in ways that made invisibility impossible going forward. Julian Krell would want to know who'd interfered with his operation. The 2 men from the garden would provide descriptions. Eventually, somehow, the trail would lead back to a janitor named Caleb Hart, who'd saved Sloane Maddox once before. His phone buzzed again. Unknown number, but he recognized the pattern. Sloane's encrypted line. He answered. "You should be talking to police right now, not calling me." "I am. I'm on hold with Detective Morrison while Marcus coordinates with private security, but I needed to tell you something." Her voice was tight with stress, but underneath that, Caleb heard steel. "Those men tonight, one of them said something before you showed up. He said the principal wants this resolved before Monday. That's 3 days from now." Monday's when your merger closes, Caleb said, pieces clicking into place. Krell's running out of time. If he can't stop the deal through intimidation, he'll have to get more aggressive. That's what I thought. Which means the evidence we gathered tonight might not be enough. Even if I threaten exposure, he might calculate that finishing this is worth the risk. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that made his chest tighten. Caleb, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. I'm always honest. If this escalates further, if Krell decides the only way to stop the merger is to eliminate me permanently, could you... She trailed off, struggling with words. I'm not asking you to be my bodyguard. I know that's not what you want. But could you at least tell me what I should do? How to stay alive when someone with unlimited resources wants me dead? Caleb's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Every rational part of his brain screamed that he'd done enough, that she had professional security and legal resources and the evidence to fight back. But he kept seeing her face on that terrace, pale and defiant, and so completely out of her depth against men who killed for money. She was brilliant in boardrooms and ruthless in business, but she'd never been hunted by people who understood violence as a tool. You get somewhere safe, he heard himself saying. Not your penthouse, not your office, somewhere Krell can't predict. You keep your security close, but you verify their loyalty. Remember, someone on your team betrayed your schedule the first time. You make copies of that evidence and you distribute it to people you trust with instructions to release it if anything happens to you. And you don't go anywhere alone, not even for 5 minutes. That sounds like a prisoner's life. That sounds like staying alive until Monday when the merger closes and Krell loses his motivation. Caleb exited the highway, getting closer to his neighborhood, to Mia and safety and the quiet life he'd built. After Monday, you'll have leverage and resources and time to fight back properly. But until then, you survive. Will you? She stopped, started again. I know you want out of this. I know you have your daughter and your life, and I have no right to ask for more. But will you at least keep your phone on? In case I need advice or... Yes. The word came out before he could stop it. I'll keep my phone on. Thank you. Relief flooded her voice. And Caleb, what you did tonight, what you've done since this started. I know you don't want gratitude, but you have it anyway. You saved my life. Again. After she hung up, Caleb sat in his parked car outside his apartment building and tried to remember why he'd thought walking away was possible. He'd gathered intelligence, provided evidence, even physically protected her when new threats emerged. But the danger wasn't over. If anything, it was intensifying. Krell had 3 days to stop a deal worth billions, and desperate men with resources did desperate things. Sloan was walking into a kill box. And despite everything Caleb had told himself about boundaries and limits and protecting his own life first, he couldn't quite accept letting her walk into it alone. He looked up at his apartment window where light glowed warm and safe. Mia would be asleep by now, curled up with her stuffed bear, dreaming about dinosaurs and adventures. Mrs. Chen would be watching television quietly, ready to stay the whole weekend if needed. His world, his responsibility, his everything that mattered. But his phone was on. And he knew with depressing certainty that when Sloan called, not if, but when, he would answer. Saturday morning arrived with autumn sunshine and Mia demanding the dinosaur-shaped pancakes he'd promised. Caleb made them while she chattered about a field trip coming up and whether they could visit the La Brea tar pits because apparently woolly mammoths were almost as cool as dinosaurs. He listened and responded and tried to be present, but part of his mind kept running through scenarios and contingencies, calculating how Krell might strike next. Around 10, his phone buzzed. Tom Briggs. Turn on the news, Tom said without greeting. Channel 7. Caleb grabbed the remote, switching to the local news while Mia played with her tablet in the living room. The screen showed a familiar face, Julian Krell, standing at a podium surrounded by reporters, his expression grave and concerned. Deeply disturbed by these allegations, Krell was saying. Ms. Maddox has been a respected colleague and competitor for years. The suggestion that I would engage in criminal activity to harm her or her company is not only false, it's defamatory. My attorneys are preparing a response as we speak. The reporter's voice cut in. Mr. Krell, sources close to Ms. Maddox claim to have evidence linking you to the recent kidnapping attempt. How do you respond? I respond by saying that desperate people make desperate accusations. Ms. Maddox is facing pressure from multiple fronts, a merger that many believe is overvalued, board members questioning her judgment, competitors gaining market share. Rather than address these legitimate business challenges, she's chosen to create a narrative where she's the victim of some grand conspiracy. Krell's smile was sympathetic, practiced. I hope she gets the help she needs. Mental health is important, especially for people under extreme stress. Caleb felt his jaw clench. It was a masterful performance, Krell positioning himself as the reasonable party, while subtly suggesting Sloane was unstable, emotional, possibly delusional. By Monday, the narrative wouldn't be about evidence or threats. It would be about whether Sloane Maddox was fit to lead her own company. His phone rang. Sloane, her voice tight with barely controlled fury. Did you see it? Did you see that sanctimonious... She cut herself off, breathing hard. He went public before I could, spun the whole thing to make me look paranoid and vindictive. My board is calling emergency meetings. Major investors are requesting reassurances about my mental state. He's destroying my credibility in real time. The evidence isn't enough. My attorneys reviewed the recordings from last night. Krell's name isn't mentioned directly. Everything's deniable, and his people can claim they were discussing theoretical scenarios or speaking hypothetically. Desperation bled into her voice. Without something concrete, something that directly ties him to the kidnapping plot, it's just accusations from a CEO who's under pressure and possibly unstable. Caleb closed his eyes, thinking fast. What about the men from last night? Did security identify them? They disappeared. No camera footage that's usable, no identification, nothing. Marcus thinks they were professionals who knew exactly how to avoid documentation. She paused. Caleb, I need your help. Real help. Not advice from a distance. I need you. Sloane, I know what you're going to say. I know about your daughter, your boundaries, your need to stay invisible. I'm not asking you to be my bodyguard or join my security team or anything public. Her words came faster now, urgent and almost pleading. But you have skills I don't have. You understand how people like Krell operate, how to find evidence that normal investigators miss. I could what? Break into his home, hack his communications, conduct illegal surveillance until I find something prosecutable? Caleb kept his voice low, aware of Mia in the next room. That's not help, Sloane. That's vigilante justice, and it ends with me in prison and my daughter in foster care. Then what should I do? The question came out raw, stripped of her usual control. Just wait for him to destroy my reputation, steal my company, maybe try to kill me again if that's more efficient? I didn't ask for this fight, Caleb. I didn't do anything except build something worth taking. And now I'm supposed to just accept that someone with more resources and fewer morals gets to win? Caleb walked to the window, staring out at the neighborhood where normal people lived normal lives without billionaires trying to destroy them or former operators trying to decide whether justice mattered more than safety. You fight with the weapons you have. Legal teams, media consultants, your board and investors who have a financial stake in your success. You make Krell's victory so costly that backing off becomes the better option. That takes time I don't have. The merger closes Monday. After that, I'll have resources and leverage. But right now, I'm vulnerable, and he knows it. She was right. Caleb hated that she was right. But strategic analysis didn't lie. Krell had positioned this perfectly. 2 days to undermine Sloane's credibility, make her look unstable, possibly force her board to delay the merger until concerns are addressed. Once the deal fell apart, Krell would consolidate his position, and Sloane would be left trying to rebuild from rubble. There has to be someone close to Krell who's vulnerable, Caleb said, thinking out loud. Someone who knows about his illegal operations but isn't loyal enough to go down with him. Someone who'd flip if the pressure was right. You mean turn one of his people? Sloane's voice shifted, becoming more focused. Get them to provide testimony or evidence in exchange for immunity. The COO, Daniel Voss. You said he drinks too much at parties, gets chatty. That suggests loose boundaries, possible substance issues, the kind of vulnerabilities that make people unreliable under stress. Caleb's mind was already working through approach vectors. If we could isolate him, apply the right pressure, he might crack. How do we pressure a man who's insulated by wealth and power? Everyone has something they're afraid of losing. We find what that is, then we threaten it. Even as he said it, Caleb felt himself crossing another line, committing to actions he'd sworn he'd never take again. But Sloan, this is the edge. Past this point, we're not gathering evidence. We're coercing testimony, manufacturing leverage through intimidation. That's illegal, unethical, and dangerous. I know. Her voice was quiet but certain. And I'm asking you to help me do it anyway. Because the alternative is watching everything I built get destroyed by a man who thinks violence is just another business strategy. Mia called from the living room, asking if they could go to the park. Caleb looked at his daughter, innocent, trusting, believing the world was fundamentally good because that's what he taught her. She deserved a father who chose safety over risk, who prioritized her above everything else, who'd learned from past mistakes about what really mattered. But she also deserved a world where bullies didn't win just because they had more money and fewer morals. Where doing the right thing sometimes required courage that looked like recklessness. Where her father showed her through actions, not just words, that protecting good people from bad ones was worth the cost. I need 24 hours to research Voss and plan an approach, Caleb said finally. And I need you to promise me something. Anything. If this goes wrong, if I get caught or compromised, you protect yourself first. You don't try to save me. You don't expose yourself to risk on my account. You let me take the fall and you walk away clean. That's the deal. Caleb, that's the deal, Sloan. Because I'm doing this for my daughter's future as much as yours. And she needs at least one parent who survives this mess. He softened his voice slightly. Promise me. I promise. But he heard the lie in her voice, the same way he heard his own lies when he told himself he could walk away after this was over. They were both in too deep now, both committed to seeing this through regardless of cost, both learning that some fights chose you whether you wanted them or not. After he hung up, Caleb stood at the window for a long moment, watching his daughter play, memorizing her laughter and innocence. Then he pulled out his laptop and started researching Daniel Voss with the systematic thoroughness he'd once brought to targeting hostile assets in foreign countries. 24 hours. That's all he'd allow himself to find leverage and pressure Voss into betraying Krell. After that, the merger would close or it wouldn't, and either way, Caleb would have done everything possible to protect the people who mattered. He just hoped that when this was over, Mia would still recognize her father, and that the man he was becoming, or maybe just remembering how to be, was someone worth recognizing at all. Met. By Sunday afternoon, Caleb had a plan. It wasn't elegant or particularly legal, but it was effective. The kind of psychological operation that targeted human weakness rather than physical security. Daniel Voss had 3 vulnerabilities: a gambling problem he thought was secret, a mistress his wife didn't know about, and offshore accounts that suggested financial crimes his employer probably hadn't authorized. Any one of these would make him desperate to avoid exposure. All 3 together would make him controllable. Caleb met Sloan in a parking garage, different one from where this had started, neutral territory with good sight lines and multiple exits. She arrived in a nondescript rental car instead of her Tesla, wearing jeans and a hoodie instead of designer clothes. She was learning to hide, learning to think tactically, and despite everything, Caleb felt a flash of approval at her adaptability. Voss owns a condo in San Jose, he said without preamble, pulling up photos on his tablet. Uses it to meet his mistress 3 times a week, always between 2 and 5 p.m. His wife thinks he's at the office. His employer thinks he's working remotely. It's a lie he's maintained for 18 months. So we expose the affair? Sloan frowned. That seems cruel to his wife more than threatening to him. We don't expose it. We threaten to expose it, along with the gambling debts and the financial irregularities. We show him we have comprehensive knowledge of his secrets, and we offer him a choice. Provide testimony about Krell's illegal activities, and we keep everything quiet, or refuse and we destroy his life methodically and publicly. That's blackmail. Yes. Caleb met her eyes steadily. That's exactly what it is. So if you're not comfortable with that, tell me now, and I'll walk away. But if you want to stop Krell, this is how we do it. We make his people more afraid of us than they are of him. Sloan was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with something internal. Finally, she nodded. What do you need from me? Access to a secure location where we can have an uninterrupted conversation with Voss. Somewhere private, somewhere he can't call for help or run. Can you arrange that? I have a property in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Bought it years ago as a retreat, never use it. No staff, no neighbors within a mile, completely off-grid. She pulled up the address on her phone. Will that work? Perfect. Now we need to get Voss there. Can you call him? Ask for a private meeting to discuss a settlement offer from Apex to Krell? Make it sound like you're waving a white flag, looking for a way to end this quietly? Understanding dawned across Sloane's face. He'll think he's coming to negotiate my surrender, that I'm too scared to keep fighting. Exactly. His ego and Krell's overconfidence will do the rest. He'll come alone because he'll assume you're not a threat, and once he's there, he's ours. 2 hours later, it was arranged. Voss had agreed to the meeting, tomorrow at noon, drawn by the prospect of watching Sloane Maddox admit defeat. He'd told no one. Sloane had insisted on discretion, and he'd been arrogant enough to believe she was simply trying to save face. As they finalized details, Sloane looked at Caleb with an expression he couldn't quite read. You're good at this. The planning, the psychological manipulation, understanding exactly what people fear most. It's almost frightening. It should be. It's what I was trained to do. Break people without touching them, find leverage, and apply it until they gave me what I needed. His voice went flat. I spent years being frightened of what I was good at, of what it said about me that I could do this kind of thing and sleep fine afterward. And now? Now I'm tired of good people getting hurt because bad people are better at being ruthless. Now I'm choosing to be frightening to the people who deserve it. He stood, preparing to leave. Tomorrow at noon. Come alone. I'll be there first to secure the location. Caleb? Sloane's voice stopped him. After this is over, after Voss testifies and Krell backs off and the merger closes, what happens to us? Us. Like they were a unit now, a team. Something more than just a janitor and a CEO thrown together by circumstances. The word lodged in Caleb's chest uncomfortably. There is no us, he said quietly. There's just two people who helped each other survive a threat. After tomorrow, you go back to running your empire, and I go back to raising my daughter. That's how this ends. But as he walked away, Caleb wondered if he was lying to her or himself. Because somewhere in the past week, Sloane Maddox had stopped being a problem to solve and had become a person he cared about. Someone brave and brilliant and damaged in ways that resonated with his own damage. Someone who made him think that maybe hiding wasn't the same as healing, and maybe Mia deserved to see her father as someone who stood up instead of someone who hid. Dangerous thoughts. The kind that got people hurt. He pushed them away and focused on tomorrow, on the operation ahead, on making sure this ended without anyone he loved paying the price for his choices. One more day, one more mission. Then he could return to the quiet life he'd built. He just had to survive what was coming first. The mountain house sat among redwoods like a secret, wood and glass and isolation, exactly what they needed. Caleb arrived at dawn, checked every entrance and exit, verified the cell signal was weak enough to discourage calls but strong enough for emergencies. He positioned himself where he could see the driveway, armed with nothing but the evidence they'd compiled and the ability to read people better than most could read books. By 11:30, Sloane had arrived, her rental car crunching up the gravel drive. She looked pale but determined, dressed in the corporate armor she wore to difficult negotiations. But her hands trembled slightly as she unlocked the door, and Caleb knew she was running on adrenaline and desperation rather than confidence. He'll be here soon, she said, checking her phone. Last text said he was 30 minutes out. Then we go over this one more time. Caleb moved to stand across from her, his voice steady and calm. When Voss arrives, you're nervous, apologetic, looking for a way to end the conflict. You're giving him exactly what his ego expects. Sloane Maddox admitting she's outmatched. That puts him at ease, makes him overconfident. And then you step in. Then I step in. I present the evidence of his affairs, his gambling, his financial crimes. I give him exactly 60 seconds to process it, then I offer the deal. Testimony against Krell in exchange for our silence about everything else. Caleb's expression hardened. He'll try to negotiate, try to find angles, try to call our bluff. You stay quiet and let me handle it. The more he thinks you're weak, the more he'll focus on me as the real threat. What if he refuses? What if he's more loyal to Krell than we think? He's not loyal, he's scared. And scared people always choose self-preservation over loyalty when the pressure's right. Caleb checked his watch. Trust me, I've done this before. 20 minutes later, a black Mercedes pulled up the driveway. Daniel Voss emerged looking exactly like his photos, mid-40s, expensive suit, the kind of self-satisfied expression that came from years of getting away with things. He walked toward the house with the swagger of someone who believed he held all the cards. Sloane opened the door before he could knock, her posture deliberately smaller, less commanding. Daniel, thank you for coming. Sloane. He stepped inside without waiting for invitation, his eyes sweeping the space. I have to say, I was surprised by your call. Julian said you'd fight this to the bitter end. Fighting seems pointless when I'm clearly outmatched. The words came out tired, defeated. I just want to find a resolution that doesn't destroy everything I've built. Voss smiled, and it was the smile of a predator who'd just watched prey bare its throat. That's very wise. Julian will be pleased to hear you're being reasonable. Before we discuss terms, Sloane said carefully, there's someone I'd like you to meet, someone who's been helping me understand my options. That's when Caleb stepped out from the kitchen, his posture casual but his presence immediately shifting the room's energy. Voss's smile faltered as he took in this new element, a man who didn't look like a lawyer or consultant, who moved with the controlled precision of someone comfortable with violence. Daniel Voss, Caleb said quietly, thanks for joining us. Why don't you have a seat? This won't take long. Who the hell are you? Voss looked between Caleb and Sloane, his confidence cracking slightly. Sloane, what is this? This is me making sure we have an honest conversation. Sloane's voice had lost its defeated tone, becoming steel wrapped in silk. Sit down, Daniel. Voss hesitated, calculating. He could leave. The door was right there, his car close enough. But curiosity and arrogance kept him rooted. He wanted to know what game was being played, confident he could still control it. He sat. Caleb placed a tablet on the coffee table between them, already open to a photo. That's you entering the San Jose condo last Wednesday at 2:47 p.m. The woman you're meeting isn't your wife. Karen's at your actual home, by the way, planning your anniversary party. Voss's face went white. You've been following me? That's from 3 weeks ago. Another photo appeared, this one showing Voss at a private poker game. You lost $47,000 that night. Added to your existing debts, you're in for about $250,000. The kind of debt that makes people desperate. The kind that makes them do things their employers wouldn't approve of. This is illegal surveillance. Here's my favorite. Caleb swiped to a document showing financial transfers. Offshore accounts in the Caymans, established using Krell Industries resources, but funneling money to your personal holdings. That's embezzlement, Daniel. 5 to 10 years if anyone bothered to investigate. Voss stood abruptly, his chair scraping back. I'm leaving. This is extortion, and I'm not participating. Sit down. Caleb's voice didn't rise, but the authority in it was absolute. You walk out that door. By tonight, your wife knows about Amanda. Your loan sharks know you've been stalling payments, and the SEC gets an anonymous tip about your financial irregularities. By tomorrow morning, you're unemployed, divorced, and under federal investigation. By next week, you're in jail or fleeing the country. Is that really the play you want to make? The color drained from Voss's face. He stood frozen, trapped between impulses, flee or fight, deny or negotiate. Finally, his legs seemed to give out and he collapsed back into the chair, his hands shaking. What do you want? The question came out broken, all his swagger evaporated. The truth about Julian Krell's involvement in planning and executing the kidnapping attempt against Ms. Maddox. Caleb sat down across from him, his posture relaxed now that dominance was established. You were in the meetings where it was discussed. You knew about the contractors, the timeline, the objectives. We need you to testify to that, officially and on record. I can't, Voss's voice cracked. Julian would destroy me. He has resources I can't even imagine. He'd do exactly what we're threatening to do, except he'd be doing it while also facing criminal prosecution for kidnapping and attempted murder. Sloane leaned forward. The difference is we're offering you a deal. You testify, you give us everything you know about Julian's operations, and in exchange we bury all of this. Your wife never finds out, your debts become your problem to solve quietly, and the SEC never gets that tip. How do I know you'll keep your word? You don't, Caleb said bluntly, but you know for certain what happens if you refuse, so you're gambling either way. Question is whether you bet on us keeping our word or on you surviving what we'll do if you don't cooperate. Voss put his head in his hands, breathing hard. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind through the redwoods outside and the ticking of an old clock on the mantel. When he looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed and defeated. What exactly do you need me to say? 2 hours later, they had it all. Voss talked like a dam breaking, confirmation that Krell had ordered the initial kidnapping, details about the contractors and payment structures, evidence of ongoing surveillance and intimidation tactics. More than that, he provided information about other illegal activities, corporate espionage, bribery of government officials, falsified security certifications for military contracts. It was a comprehensive indictment of everything Krell had built his empire on. Caleb recorded it all, his equipment capturing every word, every detail, every piece of evidence that would either free Sloan or destroy them both if it couldn't be verified. When Voss finally finished, he looked smaller somehow, diminished by confession. What happens now? Now you go home and act like nothing happened, Sloan said. You go to work tomorrow. You attend your meetings, you do exactly what you'd normally do. And when the authorities come asking questions about Julian, and they will, you cooperate fully. You tell them everything you told us. And if I don't? Then we release everything, Caleb said simply. Every photo, every document, every piece of evidence about your personal indiscretions. And we make sure Julian knows you are here today talking to us. Either way, your life as you know it ends. The only question is whether you're taking Krell down with you or going down alone. Voss left 20 minutes later, driving away with the haunted expression of someone who'd just sold their soul and wasn't sure which devil they'd sold it to. As his car disappeared down the mountain road, Sloan let out a breath she'd been holding for what felt like hours. We did it, she said softly. We actually did it. We got testimony. Now we have to make sure it holds up, and that Krell can't wiggle out of it. Caleb was already thinking ahead, planning next steps. You need to get this to the FBI today. Not local police, federal jurisdiction because it involves kidnapping and interstate commerce crimes. They'll verify Voss's testimony, build their own case, and by the time they move on Krell, he won't see it coming. Sloan nodded, pulling out her phone to make calls. But before she could dial, the sound of approaching vehicles made them both freeze. Not one car, multiple vehicles moving fast, the distinct rumble of SUVs taking the mountain road with aggressive urgency. Caleb moved to the window, his body already shifting into tactical mode. What he saw made his blood run cold. 3 black SUVs, expensive and ominous, blocking the driveway. Men emerging in dark suits, moving with coordinated precision that spoke to security training. And standing among them, his silver hair perfect even in the mountain wind, was Julian Krell himself. We've got a problem, Caleb said quietly. Sloan joined him at the window, her face going pale. How did he... Voss. He must have called the moment he left, warned Krell we'd turned him. Caleb's mind raced through options and scenarios. The house had good sight lines, but only one road out. They were trapped, unless they went on foot through the forest, and even then, Krell's people could run them down. How many people knew about this location? No one. Just us. I bought it through a shell company years ago. But even as she said it, doubt crept into her voice. Unless Voss looked up my property records, or Julian's been monitoring my communications more thoroughly than I thought. The men outside were fanning out, covering exits and establishing a perimeter. This wasn't a casual visit. This was a containment operation. Krell stood in the center of it all, checking his phone casually, like he had all the time in the world. Because he did. He knew they were trapped. Caleb's phone buzzed. Unknown number, but when he answered, Krell's smooth voice filled his ear. Mr. Hart. Yes, I know your name now. Took some digging after the charity gala, but eventually security footage and employee records told an interesting story. A janitor who's actually former Delta Force, who saved Miss Maddox not once, but twice, who's now apparently conducting illegal interrogations on her behalf. Krell's tone was almost amused. You've been very troublesome. What do you want, Krell? I want you both to come outside. We're going to have a civilized conversation about how this situation resolves in a way that doesn't end with anyone getting hurt. A pause. Well, hurt more than necessary. And if we refuse? Then my people come in and extract you forcibly. That tends to be messier, more traumatic. I'd rather avoid it if possible. Krell's voice hardened. You have 2 minutes to decide. After that, I stopped being polite. Caleb ended the call and looked at Sloane. Her face was set in grim determination, but underneath he saw the fear she was trying to control. They'd played their hand, gotten Voss's testimony, and thought they'd won. But Krell had been 3 moves ahead, using Voss as bait to locate them, and now preparing to eliminate the threat permanently. There's a back way out, Sloane said quietly. Through the forest, follows a creek bed down to a fire road. We'd make it maybe 100 yards before they ran us down. They've got training, numbers, and equipment. Running just delays the inevitable. Caleb moved away from the window, his mind working through impossible options. But if we go out there, we're on his terms, and men like Krell don't leave loose ends. So what do we do? Caleb looked at her, this brilliant, fierce woman who'd built an empire and was now trapped in a mountain house because she dared to fight back against someone who thought power made him untouchable. He thought about Mia, who'd wake up tomorrow expecting her father to make dinosaur pancakes. He thought about Sarah, who'd made him promise to take care of their daughter no matter what. And he thought about the man he'd been before he'd walked away, the operator who'd understood that sometimes the only way to win was to change the rules of engagement entirely. We call the FBI, he said quietly. Right now, before we go out there. We tell them everything, send them the recordings of Voss's testimony, and we make sure that if something happens to us, Krell goes down anyway. He'll hear us making the call. He's probably monitoring our phones. Good. Let him hear it. Let him know that killing us accomplishes nothing except guaranteeing his own destruction. Caleb pulled out his phone, already dialing the FBI field office number Sloane had looked up earlier. Sometimes the best weapon isn't silence. It's making sure your enemy knows exactly what you've done and that there's no way to undo it. The call connected. Caleb identified himself, explained they were reporting kidnapping, attempted murder, and ongoing threats from Julian Krell of Krell Industries. He gave their location and stated clearly that they were currently surrounded by armed men working for Krell. He uploaded Voss's recorded testimony to an email while staying on the line, narrating every action so it was documented in real time. Through the window, he saw Krell stiffen, his phone to his ear, his expression shifting from confidence to calculation. The FBI dispatcher was still talking in Caleb's ear, confirming agents were en route, estimated arrival 15 minutes, maintain position, and do not engage hostiles. 15 minutes. A lifetime when surrounded by armed men. Krell approached the house alone, stopping just beyond the door. His voice carried clearly. That was very clever, Mr. Hart, forcing my hand by making yourself valuable alive and worthless dead. But you're assuming federal agents will arrive before I decide that eliminating you is worth the risk. Caleb opened the door, stepping out onto the porch while keeping Sloane behind him. You're assuming you can kill us, dispose of the bodies, and disappear your people before law enforcement arrives. That's a lot of assumptions for a man who's run out of time. Time is relative when you have resources. Krell smiled, but his eyes were cold. I could have a cleanup crew here in minutes. Make this look like a murder-suicide, perhaps. Obsessed former soldier kills the CEO he's fixated on, then takes his own life. The FBI arrives to find tragedy instead of crime. Except Daniel Voss is already talking to them. Except your attorney was recorded discussing the kidnapping plot. Except you just confirmed you're here with armed men threatening us. Which means anything that happens now is witnessed and documented. Caleb held up his phone, showing the active FBI call. You've lost, Krell. The only question now is whether you're smart enough to recognize it. For a long moment, Julian Krell just stared at him. Around them, his men waited for orders, hands near weapons, ready to act. The forest was silent except for wind through redwoods and the distant sound of approaching sirens, getting closer, but not close enough. You've cost me everything, Krell said finally, his voice flat. My reputation, my company, my freedom. All because you couldn't stay out of what didn't concern you. All because you couldn't accept losing to someone you considered beneath you, Caleb corrected. Sloan Maddox built something better than you did. That must have been intolerable for someone who thinks business is warfare and competitors are enemies. But she wasn't your enemy until you made her one. The sirens were louder now, multiple vehicles racing up the mountain road. Krell's men shifted nervously, looking to their employer for guidance. But Krell's attention was fixed on Sloan, who'd stepped out to stand beside Caleb despite his silent gesture to stay inside. Was it worth it? Krell asked her. Your company's reputation will be damaged by association with this scandal. Your board will question your judgment. You'll spend years in depositions and trials. Was hurting me worth hurting yourself? I didn't hurt myself, Sloan said quietly. You did that when you decided kidnapping and murder were acceptable business strategies. I just made sure the consequences landed where they belonged. She straightened her shoulders. And yes, it was worth it, because some things matter more than stock prices and quarterly reports, like not letting bullies win just because they're willing to be more ruthless. FBI vehicles crested the hill, followed by local police as backup. Agents emerged with weapons drawn, shouting commands, and suddenly Krell's men were following orders to drop weapons and get on the ground. The situation shifted in seconds from standoff to controlled arrest scene, professional law enforcement doing what they did best. Krell stood in the center of it all, watching his empire crumble in real time. When an agent approached with handcuffs, he didn't resist. But as they led him toward a waiting vehicle, he looked back at Caleb with an expression that was almost respectful. You're good at this, Krell said. Wasted pushing a mop. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, Caleb replied. You just made me remember that sometimes doing the right thing requires skills I wished I didn't have. They took Krell away. The next hours blurred into statements and evidence processing and FBI agents asking questions that Caleb answered with careful precision. Sloan stayed close, adding her own testimony, and together they built the case that would take down one of Silicon Valley's most powerful figures. By the time they were cleared to leave, the sun was setting over the mountains and exhaustion had settled into Caleb's bones like lead. Sloan looked equally drained, but there was something different in her expression, a lightness that hadn't been there before, like a weight she'd been carrying had finally lifted. What happens now? She asked as they walked toward their cars. Now you close your merger, run your company, and deal with whatever fallout comes from all this. When Caleb managed a tired smile. Now you get to go back to being brilliant and terrifying in boardrooms instead of being hunted. And you go back to pushing a mop? I go back to raising my daughter, making pancakes, helping with homework, teaching her about dinosaurs. That's what matters. But even as he said it, the words felt incomplete somehow. Though I'm guessing Apex will be looking for a new night janitor since I'm pretty sure I violated every HR policy that exists. Sloan laughed, the sound unexpected and genuine. I was thinking more along the lines of head of personal security. Better hours, actual benefits, and a salary that doesn't require working 3 jobs. If you wanted it. I told you before. I know what you told me. But that was before. She stepped closer, her expression serious. Caleb, you spent the last week proving that hiding isn't the same as healing. You showed my daughter. She stopped, corrected herself. You showed me that sometimes the only way to protect what matters is to stop running from who you are. Who I am got my wife killed. The words came out harsh, dragged from depths he'd kept buried. Who I am meant I wasn't there when she needed me. Every operation, every mission, every time I chose duty over family, that's who I am, and I can't be that person again. You're not that person anymore. Sloan's voice was gentle but firm. You're the person who saved me because it was right, not because it was duty. You're the person who built a life around his daughter, who chose safety over capability, who walked away from violence until protecting someone innocent required walking back. That's not the same person who left his wife alone. That's someone who learned what matters most and restructured his whole world around it. Caleb wanted to argue, to explain all the reasons she was wrong. But standing there in the fading light, with Julian Krell in custody and the threat finally neutralized, he couldn't quite find the energy to keep fighting against the truth. He was different now. The years raising Mia, the grief and healing, the deliberate choice to build something peaceful, all of it had changed him in ways he hadn't fully recognized. He'd thought he was hiding from his past, but maybe he'd actually been growing beyond it, becoming someone who could use those skills without being consumed by them.
I need to think about it, he said finally. Talk to Mia. Figure out what this means for our life. I can't just take whatever time you need. Sloane pulled a business card from her pocket, writing a personal number on the back. When you're ready, call me, whether that's about a job or just to let me know you're both okay. Either way, you know where to find me. She started toward her car, then turned back. And Caleb? Thank you for everything.
You gave me my life back. That's not something I can ever fully repay. After she drove away, Caleb sat in his car and called Mrs. Chen to let her know he was on his way home. Then he just sat there, watching the stars come out over the mountains, thinking about choices and consequences, and the complicated truth that sometimes the person you used to be could help you become who you needed to be next. His phone buzzed. Text from Tom Briggs. Saw the news. Krell arrested. FBI moving on his whole organization. You good? Caleb typed back. Yeah, it's over. I'm coming home. Glad to hear it. Your girl needs her dad. The drive back took 2 hours, and by the time Caleb pulled up to his apartment, it was past 9. But lights glowed in his windows, and he could see Mrs. Chen moving around inside, probably putting Mia to bed with the extra stories she always allowed when Caleb worked late. He let himself in quietly. Mia was in her pajamas, arguing with Mrs. Chen about whether pterodactyls counted as dinosaurs for a school project that wasn't due for another week. When she saw Caleb, her face lit up like sunshine breaking through clouds. Dad! She launched herself at him, all 7 years and boundless energy. You're home. Mrs. Chen said you might be really late, but you're not that late. Did you have a good day at work? Caleb caught her, pulling her close, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo and the innocence that he'd fight wars to protect. I had a long day, but it's better now. Can we do dinosaur pancakes tomorrow? And can we maybe go to the museum again? Because I have new questions about the Mesozoic era. We can do whatever you want, sweetheart. He carried her toward her room, Mrs. Chen following with a knowing smile. But first, bedtime. And maybe you tell me what happened in school today, because I missed you, and I want to hear everything. As Mia launched into detailed explanations of recess politics and what her teacher had said about fossils, Caleb felt something settle in his chest, a sense of rightness he hadn't felt in longer than he could remember. This was home. This was what mattered. Everything else was just the price he paid to keep this safe. But later, after Mia was asleep and Mrs. Chen had gone home and the apartment was quiet, Caleb pulled out Sloane's business card. He stared at the number she'd written, thinking about second chances and whether hiding was really the same as protecting. Mia deserved a father who showed her that doing the right thing sometimes meant being brave, that having skills and not using them to help people was its own kind of cowardice, that the world needed people who stood between the innocent and those who'd hurt them, and that being one of those people didn't mean abandoning what you loved. It meant finding ways to serve both duty and family. He didn't call. Not yet. But he put the card in his wallet where he'd see it every day, where it would remind him that some doors stayed open even when you weren't ready to walk through them. Tian. 3 months later, on a Tuesday afternoon, Caleb stood in Sloane's office overlooking the city. The view was the same, 62 floors of glass and steel, but something felt different. The woman behind the desk looked lighter somehow, more at ease in her own skin. Her merger had closed successfully, Krell Industries had collapsed in scandal, and Apex Technologies had emerged stronger than ever. So, Sloane said, gesturing to the chair across from her, you called. Does that mean you've made a decision? Caleb sat, his hands relaxed in his lap. He'd spent 3 months thinking, talking to Mia about change and what it might mean, consulting with Tom about whether he could do security work that didn't require the parts of himself he'd left behind. And slowly, carefully, he'd realized that Sloane had been right. He wasn't the same person who'd left Sarah alone, but he also wasn't just a janitor hiding from his past. He was someone in between, someone who could use his skills to protect people who needed it while maintaining boundaries that kept his family first. It was possible to be both things. It had just taken him years to believe it. I'll take the job, he said, but with conditions. I work reasonable hours so I can be there for Mia. I don't travel unless it's absolutely necessary, and if a situation requires me to choose between this company and my daughter's needs, she wins every time. Agreed. Sloan didn't hesitate. Anything else? I want to build a program, something that helps veterans and single parents transition into meaningful work. People who have skills but need flexibility, who are trying to rebuild lives around families. We could... Yes. Sloan was already pulling up documents on her laptop. I've been thinking about something similar since this whole thing ended. People like you shouldn't have to choose between using your capabilities and raising your children. We can build something that accommodates both. They spent the next hour planning, sketching out ideas, building something that could help others the way Caleb wished someone had helped him years ago. And somewhere in that conversation, Caleb realized they'd stopped being just two people thrown together by crisis. They'd become something like partners, maybe even something like friends. There's something else, Sloan said as he was preparing to leave. Something I've been meaning to ask. What's that? Mia's birthday is coming up next month. I saw it in your HR file. She stopped, looking uncertain in a way that was unusual for her. I know we're not exactly traditional friends, and I know I have no place in your personal life, but I'd like to send her something, if that's okay. Maybe a book about paleontology, or she'd love that, Caleb interrupted gently. And Sloan, you're wrong about one thing. What's that? You do have a place in our lives now. Maybe not traditional, maybe not easily defined, but you're part of how we got here, part of what made it possible for me to stop hiding. That matters. He managed to smile. Besides, Mia asks about you sometimes. The lady Dad helped. She thinks you must be pretty cool to be worth all the late nights I worked. She doesn't know what really happened. She knows her dad helped someone who was in trouble. She knows that sometimes doing the right thing is scary, but you do it anyway. That's enough for now. He headed for the door, then paused. But maybe someday when she's older, I'll tell her the whole story. About the woman who built an empire and the janitor who remembered he was more than his mistakes. About how they helped each other survive and ended up better for it. I'd like that, Sloan said softly. The story ending with both of us better. Caleb left her office and took the elevator down to the executive parking garage. The same place this had all started 3 months ago. But now he had a reserved spot with his name on it, a key card that opened doors beyond janitorial closets, and a future that looked different than anything he'd imagined when he was pushing mops and trying to stay invisible. His phone buzzed with a text from Mia's school. She'd won first place in the science fair for her project on fossilization. Pride swelled in his chest so strong it was almost painful. He texted back, "That's my girl. So proud of you. Pick you up in 20 minutes and we'll celebrate." Her response came immediately. "Can we get ice cream? And can we call Mrs. Chen and tell her?" "Absolutely. And we have other news too. Dad got a new job." "Doing what?" "Helping people stay safe. Using skills I already have to do something good." "That's perfect, Dad. That's exactly what heroes do." Caleb sat in his car, staring at that message, feeling something shift in his chest. Heroes. He'd never thought of himself that way. Just a man trying to survive his own mistakes, trying to be better for his daughter. But maybe that's what heroism actually was. Not the absence of fear or failure, but the choice to keep trying despite both. He drove to Mia's school, picked her up, listened to her excited explanation of her science project, and how the judges had loved her hypothesis about pressure and time. They got ice cream, 2 scoops for her, 1 for him, and called Mrs. Chen, who promised to bring over dumplings to celebrate properly. That evening, sitting in their small apartment with dinosaur drawings on the walls and fossils displayed on shelves, Caleb felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the fragile peace of hiding, but the solid peace of someone who'd faced his demons and come out the other side still standing. His phone rang, Sloan's number. "Sorry to bother you after hours," she said when he answered. "But I wanted you to know Daniel Voss testified today. Full cooperation, everything we needed. The federal case against what's left of Krell's organization is solid. It's really over." "That's good news." "It is, but that's not why I called." She paused, and Caleb heard something vulnerable in her voice. "I wanted to say thank you again. Not for saving my life or gathering evidence or any of the tactical things, but for showing me that being powerful and being connected aren't mutually exclusive. That walls keep out danger, but they also keep out everything worth having." "Sloan, I'm not asking for anything, she continued quickly. I just wanted you to know that you changed my life in ways that go beyond business or survival. You reminded me what it means to care about someone beyond what they can do for you. That's a gift I didn't know I needed. After she hung up, Caleb sat in the quiet apartment, listening to Mia brush her teeth and sing to herself in the bathroom. He thought about Sarah, about the promises he'd made and the ways he'd tried to keep them. He thought about Sloane, about walls and bridges, and the courage it took to build both. And he thought about himself, not who he'd been or who he'd tried to become, but who he actually was right now in this moment. A father first, always, but also someone capable of protecting others, of standing between threats and innocence, of using hard-won skills for something that mattered. He could be both things. He was both things. And maybe that was enough. Mia appeared in her doorway, clutching her stuffed bear. Dad, can you tell me a story before bed? Sure, sweetheart. What kind of story? She thought for a moment, her dark curls bouncing. A story about someone brave, someone who was scared but did the right thing anyway. Caleb smiled, pulling her onto the couch beside him. I know exactly the story to tell you. And as he began, carefully editing out the dangerous parts, keeping the truth that mattered, he realized he was telling their story. His and Sloane's and Mia's and even Sarah's. A story about people who'd been broken by life and had found ways to rebuild. About choosing courage over comfort, connection over isolation, hope over fear. It wasn't the story he'd thought he was living when this started. But as Mia snuggled against him, listening with rapt attention, Caleb understood that the best stories were never the ones you planned. They were the ones that found you in the darkness and led you back toward light. One choice at a time. One brave moment at a time. One day at a time until you looked around and realized you'd built something worth having from the ruins of what you'd lost. Outside, the city hummed with life. Somewhere out there, Sloane Maddox was probably still working, building her empire, learning to let people past her walls one careful step at a time. Tomorrow, Caleb would start his new job, would begin the work of creating something that helped others the way he wished he'd been helped. And Mia would go to school with her science fair ribbon, proud of her dad's new job, confident that the world was fundamentally good because the people she loved showed her it could be. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. And as Mia's breathing deepened into sleep against his shoulder, Caleb closed his eyes and let himself believe it. Finally, after years of running, years of hiding, years of trying to become someone other than who he was, he could just be. Father and protector, survivor and hero, broken and healing all at once.